It was once said that no European island lies in so lamentable and hostile a solitude as Ireland, who has no neighbour on her right hand but her conqueror, and nothing at all on her left hand but the desolate ocean. Not one dry step until you get to America. The location of this once wild land on the continent's outermost fringes has certainly helped shape its fortunes. For the story of Ireland is very much a story of resistance to England, the dominant partner in a geographically enforced marriage, who has often abused her, but more often simply neglected her. Neglect is nothing new to a land that was once thought to be on the very edge of the world. Ireland has been a home to man since the earliest times. On the denuded lunar-like surface of the Burren, a vast limestone plateau that covers much of County Clare, evidence of ancient peoples stands proud in stone. The same is true all over Ireland. From the bleakness of Roscommon's Brickleave Mountains, megalithic burial sites rise up out of the landscape. But the most spectacular proof that humans walked these lands long before the birth of Christ comes from the passage graves that lie alongside the River Boyne at Newgrange. These suggest that Ireland was inhabited as early as 7000 BC. One of Europe's most significant prehistoric sites, this huge circular man-made mound, although now largely covered with grass and earth, is made of white and black boulders. It was once surrounded by a great circle of standing stones, witnesses to man's reverence for the power of the sun, a power that was harnessed by a unique aperture in the roof box above the entrance, which is so arranged that the sun's rays penetrate to illuminate the chamber within only at the winter solstice. But it is to a later age that Ireland owes the foundation of its cultural roots. This granite boulder at Turow in County Galway dates from the 3rd century BC, and its intricate designs, also found at places like Leytaen on the continent, are the marks of a civilization that came mainly from France and Spain, the Celts. The Celts, or Gaels, brought a sophisticated tradition to Ireland. Farmers and herdsmen, they were grouped in clans that were divided into families. The spirit of Irish Celtic greatness is perhaps best recalled through one place, of which an early poet wrote, "Great, noble and beautiful truly was our Tara of the kings." For it was here that the triennial parliament was founded 7 or 8 centuries before Christ. The great, beautiful hill boasted many buildings, including a great banqueting hall. Celtic society comprised numerous small kingdoms, and each of the provincial kings had, on Tara, a house that was set aside for him when he came up to attend the great parliament. There was also an assembly of the people in general, where the ancient laws were recited and confirmed. New laws were enacted, disputes settled, and wrongs righted. Puck's Fair, 3 days of revelry that takes place each August in the Kerry town of Killorglin, may seem a long way from ancient Tara. But when people gather here to celebrate and enjoy the crack, they are very much in tune with a storytelling tradition practiced by the Celts for 1,000 years before the introduction of writing. There is also another way in which Puck's Fair links the present to early Celtic tradition. The focal point of this extravaganza is the parading and elevating to great height of a goat.
And here he comes, His Majesty, Puck Fair, King of Puck 1999, and Puck on goat. In case you're wondering what's happening, you're in Killorglin on the first day of Puck. And traditionally, we crown a wild mountain goat as King of the Fair. Nobody knows why we do it. Nobody cares why we do it. We just do it.
Noble friends, we are gathered here once more to celebrate an ancient and cherished tradition handed down to us from our forefathers and from their forefathers before them.
Why such an unwitting beast should have such nobility thrust upon it may be of little consequence to most visitors. But, whether they are aware of it or not, the ennobling of the goat is a throwback to pagan Celtic ritual sacrifice. But the Celts didn't rely solely on their gods for protection. By the end of the 2nd century, fearing invasion by the Romans, who occupied neighbouring Britain, they founded a great standing army, led by Finn McCool. Known as the Fenians, they pledged to guard the harbours from foreign invaders. In the event, the Romans never set foot upon these shores. But what happened next was both influenced by and influential upon Celtic culture, and represented another step in the development of a unique Irish identity. It was here, in Strangford Lough, on a wet and blustery day such as this, that in the year 432, a ship was blown ashore by the wind and tide. On board was a missionary and bishop who was returning to Ireland. One day he would be known everywhere as St. Patrick. It is unlikely that the appearance of Christianity in Ireland was the result of one mission. It probably spread gradually from Roman Britain through trade, piracy, and the presence of captured slaves. By the early 5th century, Christianity was sufficiently widespread in the south of the country for the Pope to send a deacon to administer to them. A succession of missionaries followed, and St. Patrick was simply one of them, working amongst the still pagan peoples in the north of the country. However, he was by far the most influential. Given the circumstances, it is not surprising that the man destined to become Ireland's patron saint was actually born in England. The son of a civil servant in Roman Britain, Patrick was abducted and sold into slavery in County Antrim.
During that time he had his conversion experience. I mean, he actually attributes his captivity to the fact that he didn't listen to his priests. So on the hillside he becomes a Christian, if you like. He has this conversion experience where he speaks of God taking him out of the miry pit and setting him up on the rock and so on. And then Patrick has one of his well-known visions. And this is a vision where he's told in the dream to leave the place of captivity, to move quite a long distance, and there, when he gets to the port, the harbour, a boat will be waiting for him. We're not sure where this is. Did he end up in some part of Europe, possibly, with the barbarian attacks and desolations when he speaks about going through this wilderness and so on. But that's a big empty place. But he does tell us that at some point in time he returns home to his family, and they of course tell him to never ever leave again, to stay with them. Very glad to see him.
But Patrick did leave again, although this time it was a vision rather than slavery that compelled him.
This vision is a beautiful vision where he dreams of a man called Victoricus. This man has a basket full of letters, and then I think the real point for Patrick is that he hears the voice, but it's the voice of the Irish, and they say, "Return to us, O holy boy, and come and walk with us once more."
Following his return in 432, Patrick sailed up the River Slaney, which today is a mere stream, and set foot on Irish soil just outside Saul. It is at this hilltop site at Saul that he is said to have made his first Irish convert, a local chief, who gave him a barn to use as a church. The barn may have long since gone, but since 1932, St. Patrick's Memorial Church has stood here in its stead. It was built to commemorate the 1500th anniversary of St. Patrick's Landing. There is no doubt that his mission had the full backing of the Roman Church, but what kind of man was he?
One document's called his Confession, which he wrote out when he was an old man. It's not very detailed in terms of a biography, but it gives us a real insight into what he was like, and we can pick out personal characteristics of humility, and honesty and so on, and bravery as well.
It was in his confession that Patrick wrote, "I came to the people of Ireland to preach the gospel and to suffer insult from the unbelievers, bearing the reproach of my going abroad and many persecutions, even unto bonds, and to give my free birth for the benefit of others." But despite this compassion and strength of character, Patrick was very much a human being.
Another document was a letter to an English noble, Caroticus, and in that you see a very fierce Patrick, who's basically rebuking this man who sent his soldiers over to take converts, Patrick's converts, as slaves. So you see that Patrick obviously had a bad temper, if you like, righteous anger, if you can call that. So this is the historical Patrick.
Today, a statue of St. Patrick stares down from a hilltop near where he first landed in Ireland, symbolizing his influence over not just this small part of Ulster, but the whole future of Ireland. But despite his high ideals, in order to achieve such influence, Patrick had to adopt very pragmatic means. It was for this reason that he travelled to Armagh. Today, Armagh is a city of just 12,000 people, but its importance far exceeds its size. Its graceful appearance, with many fine Georgian buildings, befits its status as a county town. It has its own observatory, located on College Hill, and nearby stands Ireland's only planetarium. But perhaps the most striking feature of this city is that it has two cathedrals, one Roman Catholic, the other Protestant. They sit on opposite hills, as if, as someone once said, they were the horns of a dilemma. And in many ways they are, for they provide a visible expression of the religious divide that has gripped the region for centuries. Yet they share a common root, as evidenced by the fact that they are both called St. Patrick's. So why did St. Patrick come here around the year 445?
Like a missionary bishop in any part of the world, he wanted to set up his church in a very clear way. And one way of doing that, of course, would be to go to a centre of political power, of royal power, and also of religious power. I mean, Ireland was not a land where people were running around in the midst of stupidity. They had their own gods, their own traditions, their own belief systems. And Armagh was a centre of that.
On the site of this 19th century house, known as St. Patrick's Fold, the missionary established his first church in Armagh. More importantly, he chose the city as the centre of the new religion and declared that it should take precedence over all other churches in Ireland. It has, ever since, remained the country's ecclesiastical capital. As such, it also became a centre of learning. So much so that in 1162, an ecclesiastical synod decreed that only those who had studied at Armagh could teach theology elsewhere in Ireland. It was this connection between Christianity and education that was to prove so influential in the years following St. Patrick. And the effect it had owed everything to the methods by which he chose to promote Christianity.
Oh, the green and red of Mayo, I can see it still. It's soft and craggy boglands, it's tall majestic hills, where the ocean kisses Ireland and the waves caress its shore. Oh, the feeling it came over me to stay forevermore, forevermore. From its rolling coastal waters I can see Croagh Patrick's Peak, where one Sunday every summer the pilgrims climbed a reek, where St. Patrick in its solitude looked down across Clough, and with the ringing of his bell called the faithful there to pray, there to pray.
Dominating the south shore of Clew Bay in County Mayo is a mountain renowned both for ancient legend and Christian spirituality. Today, Croagh Patrick offers a challenge in more ways than one. Every year, thousands of tourists attempt the long walk to the summit. Some, it must be said, find the climb easier than others.
Oh. Please God, let me make it.
I'm knackered.
Oh dear Lord. Now we know how he felt on his way to Calvary, and he fell 3 times. I have begun to eat your heart out.
85 kilos dragging it up there. It's not fair on the body.
Years and years of smoking and drinking.
All those who eventually make it to the top are rewarded with magnificent views. But for some, there is also a spiritual reward. For, as well as being a tourist destination, Croagh Patrick is a place of pilgrimage. As they pause to reflect in the chapel that is perched on this peak, many people will recall how, centuries before, St. Patrick ascended to this same spot in his bid to bring Christianity to Ireland. At the time, the mountain was a sacred peak to the pagan god Crum, but rather than confront paganism, Patrick did quite the opposite. On his return, he told how he had battled for 40 days and nights with a legion of evil spirits, including the devil's mother, before crushing his foes and declaring the summit sacred to the Christian god. This rich image is drawn directly from Ireland's ancient tradition of storytelling that was also evident at places like Tara. By drawing upon it, Patrick was able to utilize existing beliefs in his efforts to propagate the Christian message. So, as the Celts converted to the new religion, they also remained loyal to their own cultural background.
It is interesting that right through that whole Celtic Christian period, that yes, they did recognise the importance of went before, the use of stone, the use of water and so on. In the various legendary accounts you see Patrick's affinity with nature and so on. So yes, these things were adopted, but there is a significant shift. But obviously it worked to their advantage, because you look at the success of the Christian mission in Ireland and it's quite phenomenal, and I think this in some ways explains it.
It is said that shortly before his death in the year 461, St. Patrick gave instructions for his body to be placed on a cart pulled by 2 wild oxen, and that he should be buried wherever the oxen stopped. Some believe that Patrick was buried at Saul, but it is generally held that St. Patrick's last resting place is here at Downpatrick, which until 1973 was the county town of County Down. Its name is partly derived from the saint and partly from the prefix Dún, the Irish name for an early pre-Christian fort. The original fort developed into an ecclesiastical city clustered round the cathedral, which is said to have been built on the site of St. Patrick's first stone church. And it is in the grounds of the cathedral that a granite slab marks what is claimed to be the saint's last resting place. Although the site may have ancient significance, the stone certainly does not, for it was placed here in the early 20th century. But just as Patrick harnessed legends in his life, so he has become the subject of them in his death.
The most common stories of Patrick, things like the shamrock and the stake, are very interesting. The shamrock, where St. Patrick is supposed to have taught the Trinity, I mean, it's such a well-recognised symbol. We think that, the earliest record of the connection between Patrick and the shamrock dates back to the 17th century, which is very modern.
With the proliferation of such stories, it would seem that St. Patrick has himself become a part of the very folklore tradition that owes its continued existence to him. Evidence of the way that tradition has become intertwined with Christianity remains plentiful in the Ireland of today. Most of the holy wells, where people still come to pray, were also deemed holy in pre-Christian times. But the links to a magical past go beyond this. "1,400 years after the death of St. Patrick, the village of Knock in County Mayo was still nothing more than a quiet little settlement on a wind-swept ridge in the middle of a blanket bog.
Holy Mary, Mother of God.
Today, it attracts pilgrims from all over Ireland and beyond. It has gained a reputation as the Lourdes of Ireland, with the sick and disabled assuming prominent status among the huge crowds as they come here to pray for release from their afflictions. The basilica, which can hold 12,000 people, dominates the village. The devotion shown by the thousands of ordinary people who make the pilgrimage to Knock is genuinely moving, and proof enough, if proof were needed, of the grip that St. Patrick's Christian message took over Ireland.
Give them new hope, courage and strength and happiness.
But the manner in which this once sparsely populated place was transformed also contains echoes of the distant past. It all began on a wet August evening in 1879, when 15 local people saw the figures of Mary, Joseph and St. John the Evangelist silhouetted on the gable of the local church. Following examination, a church commission accepted their account and the era of pilgrimages was underway. Devotion to the shrine was further increased after 1979, when the Pope came to Ireland at the invitation of the local priest to celebrate the shrine's centenary. The Knock phenomenon has grown to a rare and exceptional degree, but there is nothing particularly exceptional about apparitions of the type that inspired it.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Mary, Mother of God, pray for us.
In 1985, for example, thousands of people began to go on pilgrimages in various parts of Ireland, following numerous claims that statues had been seen moving. The Catholic authorities advised people to seek rational rather than supernatural explanations, but this did little to abate the flow of pilgrims until the strange sightings ceased as suddenly as they had begun. Among the byproducts of this episode was a book which included accounts of apparitions from the past, and a learned essay pointing out that the idea of moving statues had arisen in the Middle Ages and was the subject of many Irish tales and legends. It might be difficult to prove what really happened in Knock in 1879, but there is no doubt that the Celtic folklore tradition encompassed by St. Patrick's Christianity has remained as influential as ever down the centuries. Just as early Christianity found value in pre-existing practices, today's new religion of consumerism is also thriving, thanks to the presence of an old tradition. Back in the 5th century, crowds such as those at Knock would have been unthinkable, for Ireland's total population was only 500,000. Equally alien was the strong influence of the Church of Rome. Indeed, it was the very absence of Rome's influence that shaped the development of Ireland in the wake of St. Patrick. The Romans had never had the inclination to conquer Ireland. They already had more than enough on their hands, holding on to southern Britain. The absence of Roman influence from these lands meant there was none of the infrastructure of towns and cities that had grown up in Britain and elsewhere in Europe. In the years following St. Patrick's mission to Ireland, Christianity continued to grow in influence. But the Celtic Church acquired a unique identity that set it apart from what was happening elsewhere.
When Constantine converted to Christianity, the Roman Emperor Constantine, well then the Christian Church changed completely at that stage because they adopted the organization of the Roman Empire and their bishops and archbishops and that. They followed the civil divisions of the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire had never come to Ireland, so when St. Patrick came to Ireland with his followers, then there was no civil structure. In fact, one could say that the civil structure of the Christian churches really is adopted from the Roman Empire. But in Ireland, the Roman civil structure didn't exist, so the church had to adopt itself to the actual tribal structure in Ireland that existed at the time. And with the result of that, a monastic system became predominant in Ireland, whereas the hierarchical administration of the Christian churches in the rest of Europe was based on the Roman Empire. In that period in Ireland, for 300 or 400 years, the monastic system predominated, and the bishops hadn't any authority except for confirmations and ordinations.
In Ireland's tribal society, bishops assumed the same status as a local king, with the monasteries coming under the authority of the abbots. This particularly suited the kinship-based social system.
As the monastic system became established in Ireland, each petty king tried to have a monastery in his area, and then they also tried to have one of their own family as abbot of that monastery. So that also increased was a great recruiting agent for the church as well. That the chieftains always tried to encourage members of their own family to join the monastery so that they would always have someone available to be abbot of the monastery when the abbotship became vacant in their own administrative area.
The monastery of Clonmacnoise in County Offaly is one of the most famous monastic sites in Ireland. It is the burial place of the kings of Connacht and Tara, as well as Rory O'Connor, the last High King of Ireland, who was laid to rest here in 1198. Although none of the surviving ruins is earlier than the 9th century, the settlement dates back to 545, when it was founded by St. Kieran. While training under St. Enda, Kieran is said to have had a vision of a great tree growing in the centre of Ireland. St. Enda interpreted this as a church founded on the banks of the Shannon, and so it was that Kieran came to settle here. As Christianity took hold in Ireland, monasteries such as this became centres of population.
They didn't just concern them with religious matters. They had a room for travellers. If people were travelling, they could stay in the monastery. They had a hospital, or the equivalent of the hospital at the time, and they were very good organised agriculturalists. They had their own mill and all of that. So they were a major economic factor. A monastic settlement was a major economic factor in its area. Not all of the people involved in the monasteries would have been monks at the time. Some of them would have been, but others would have been just associated with the monastery, working with it. They generally had hundreds of acres of land and stores and that, so they were a major factor in an area.
Another aspect of monastic life was their schools, where the monks taught church Latin and the study of religious texts. Libraries contained copies of the scriptures, some classical authors and some history. All this meant that, as well as allowing the tradition of storytelling to live on, through the introduction of Latin, Christianity gave Ireland a written language for the first time.
When the St. Patrick came to Ireland, there wasn't really any written language in Ireland at that time. There was some basic writing for monuments and that called Ogham, but it wasn't really developed enough to put literature down in a recorded form. So the first recordings of the history of Ireland were done by the monks in the monasteries. Before that, you just had an oral tradition which was recorded the events in song and passed down in stories and that. So those were recorded by the monks in annals and so on. So there's more of the early Irish history survives than in most other countries because those monasteries wrote a lot of it down, the old Irish writing.
By 500 AD, the Roman Empire had declined, leaving a vacuum that plunged most of Europe into the Dark Ages. From being a major force, Christianity was threatened by a reversion to paganism. But for Ireland, it was a golden age, and the Celtic Church became an oasis of learning.
Most of the great Roman libraries, or all of the great Roman libraries, were destroyed by the invasion of the tribes from the east. But copies of a lot of those textbooks were made in the Irish Church and existed, and when the Irish monks went back into Europe, they carried that knowledge back in with them to Europe. The knowledge of the classical Greek language had died out in Europe, and it was only survived in the Irish monastic system. So that allowed the Greek knowledge of the Greek civilization and the Roman civilization to survive.
It was as if Ireland had been holding Europe's heritage in a time capsule, ready for the day when it could be returned. Among the monks who spread Christianity back out from Ireland's monasteries was a royal prince of Ulster, a member of the powerful Northern O'Neill clan. Today, Columkill, or St. Columba, as he is sometimes known, is remembered here at Gartan in County Donegal, the place of his birth. He was destined for a religious life from the very beginning, for when the time came for him to be fostered, as was the Irish custom, he was placed with the priest who had baptized him. Since clerical and secular power were regarded as complementary in early Ireland, a religious role would have been seen as prestigious by his family. Following an extensive ecclesiastical education, Columkill went on to found numerous monasteries in Ireland, proving himself to be both determined and capable. But conflict awaited him. While he had been building monasteries, Diarmid, one of the southern O'Neill clan, had been cementing his grip on the kingship of Tara. By 558, he was powerful enough to effectively declare himself High King. The northern O'Neills were bound to oppose this claim, and a clash was inevitable. Columkill's personal involvement in the ensuing battle was probably motivated by the close relationship Diarmid had developed with the Druids. Columkill was strongly opposed to a High King who supported paganism, even more so one who clashed with his family's interests. 3,000 died in the battle, and it is believed that Columkill's remorse at his part in the slaughter led him to eventually seek voluntary exile. And so it was that in 563 AD, accompanied by 12 followers, Columkill sailed north and landed on the remote Scottish island of Iona. The settlement he founded on Iona still exists today. Although such self-imposed exile may seem extreme in today's world, it was consistent with the thinking of the 6th century.
Recent analysis of the texts that survived from that time indicate that the Irish monastic system was very tied up with the study of the martyrs in the church, those that were put to death because of their beliefs in the early Roman Empire. And at that time, it was a big thing to leave your own civilization and go into a strange civilization. And they felt that they were doing something similar by going out into other countries to preach the gospel. They were breaking the connection with their own families and own civilization. And they felt that was the equivalent of martyrdom.
It is from Iona that the Christian message was spread out back across Britain and Europe. But Columkill's success in carrying out his mission owed much to his family connections.
Now, because he was from the royal family in Ireland, he had access to the kings in Scotland. even though they weren't Christians, they still accepted him into their courts and gave him land to form monastic settlements. Of course, those monastic settlements didn't just deal with religious things. They had the equivalent of hospitals in those days. So they brought a lot of skills to an area. So the kings would have seen those as an economic advantage to have them there. They wouldn't have seen them necessarily as a religious thing. Subsequent to Columbkill's death, the monks from Iona and various other Columban settlements spread out over Europe and brought Christianity back into the Rhine Valley and northern Italy and into France. And if one looks up the records of that period of Christianity from about 600 to 900 and even later on to 10 or 1100 AD, you will find a huge number of names of bishops there that are Irish. In fact, some of the dioceses in the Rhine Valley had Irish bishops for up to 200 or 300 years. They always came to the Irish Church for their bishops. So the actual impact of the Irish Christianity in Europe at that time was vital. Without that, it's doubtful if Christianity would have survived as a major force in Europe.
From a forgotten land on the remote edge of a continent, Ireland had been transformed into the cradle from which that continent's destiny would be reborn. On the way, it had gathered together the seeds of its own unique identity, which, in one form or another, would remain with it even to the present day. The Celtic Christian culture produced many works of great beauty. Among the most famous to have survived is the Book of Kells, an illustrated manuscript of the Gospels, which was produced in Kells Monastery in the 8th century. Other surviving Celtic legacies include the many sandstone high crosses that are scattered across the Irish landscape. Most of them date from the same period as the Book of Kells, for their elaborate carvings were designed as a means of teaching Bible stories. The scenes depicted include saints, scriptural scenes, and judgment scenes. These rich symbols are proof indeed that Ireland had truly become the land of saints and scholars. But how long could this golden age survive? By the 9th century, as Viking invaders stormed up Ireland's coast and rivers, the monasteries were prime targets. Many of the tall towers found at monastic settlements were built as lookouts and refuges against Norse invaders. But the Vikings did more than simply plunder. They began to settle as traders, and the settlements they founded would later grow into Ireland's first towns and cities. One such city is Limerick, whose Viking origins are revealed in its name, which comes from the Norse for rich land. It was founded by Danish Vikings with the purpose of using it as a base from which to plunder the rich agricultural hinterland. Modern Limerick is Ireland's 4th largest city and the main administrative and commercial centre of the Midwest region. On the north bank of the Abbey River, an eastern tributary of the Shannon, lies the historic centre known as Englishtown. Here there are many examples of fine medieval architecture. This area also contains the city's oldest building, the Anglican Cathedral. Next to where the Thomond Bridge crosses the Shannon stands King John's Castle. Originally built as a Norman fortification, the tower, built in around 1200, is the oldest surviving part. The castle has been an important bastion down several centuries. Opposite Englishtown, on the south bank of the Abbey River, is Irishtown. The architecture here is of generally more recent origin. John Square, for example, was started in 1751. The 3-story houses that border the square on 3 sides were originally occupied by the wealthier citizens of Limerick. On the southern edge of the old Irish town is St. John's Roman Catholic Cathedral, built in 1861. The 280-foot spire, completed 22 years after the main building, is the tallest in Ireland. Just as Irishtown was a development out from the historic centre, So the district known as Newtown Perry reflects a further expansion of the city southwards. With its many Georgian houses and wide parallel streets, it is a fine example of 18th century town planning. There is a traditional claim amongst Irish people that they detest Limerick, but with its impressive buildings, wide bridges and old quays, it is hard to understand why. It is true that many of the city's leading industries, such as grain milling, that were developed towards the end of the 19th century have since declined. However, with the more recent arrival of modern businesses like computer manufacturing and electronics, Limerick has gained a new lease of life. This is reflected in the busy shopping streets that give it a lively atmosphere. Like other Viking cities, Limerick endured centuries of turmoil following its foundation. At the heart of the turmoil was not just the resistance of the native Irish to the Vikings, but the squabbles between the many petty Irish kingdoms that had persisted since pagan times. Although the notion of a high king uniting the whole of Ireland had grown up, the incumbent had never really been more than a figurehead. But all that was to change. At the monastery of Clonmacnoise, a young man called Brian, youngest son of King Cneithig MacLurcan of Thomond, was receiving his education. His appetite for reading histories of the military leaders of Europe would one day help him become a great military tactician. He was still in his teens when his brother sent for him to learn the ways of the warrior and to take his place fighting the Norsemen at Limerick. Some years later, in 962, he found himself here, in the hills of Clare. He had fallen out with his brother, the King of Thomond, about making peace with the Norse, and was leading a handful of followers in a guerrilla war against the Norse of Limerick. The skirmishes lasted several years, and finally Brian, with about 15 warriors remaining, returned to the King of Thomond. What happened next was centered around this outcrop of limestone that rises imposingly from the Tipperary plain. It is easy to see why the Rock of Cashel, with its commanding position, was a place of great importance in the 10th century. The capital of Munster, Ireland's largest province, it was at the center of the fighting that was taking place between the many branches of the McCarthy clan for the right to be king of this region. The buildings we find on the rock today date from different periods, the earliest being of 12th century origin, and the site was given to the ecclesiastical authorities. It was nevertheless to this very place that Brian's clan marched, and it was here that his brother was proclaimed and crowned King of Munster in 968, after destroying the Norsemen of Limerick. It was 10 years after the crowning of his brother that Brian himself was crowned King of Thomond, and after that, King of Munster, on the coronation stone here at the Rock of Cashel. Around this time, he married for a second time, probably tactically, as a means of gaining power against the mighty O'Neill clan. It was here at Killaloe, on the eastern edge of County Clare on the shore of Lough Derg, that Brian established his palace. Today, Killaloe is a popular fishing centre and the southern limit for cruising and yachting on the River Shannon. But in the 10th century, the Palace of Kincora that stood on this site was the most magnificent palace that any Irish king had occupied up to that time. From his palace, Brian would entertain his guests and shower them with gifts, setting new standards for hospitality. His enemies were treated the same as friends and allies, for, perhaps because of his early studies, he had developed into a master negotiator and diplomat. From 978 to 988, he fought numerous battles to subdue local warring factions and gradually gained control of the whole of the southern half of Ireland. As Irish law allowed for more than one wife at a time, Brian made skillful use of marriage to increase his influence. By marrying the mother of the future Viking King of Dublin, he gained allegiance with the Viking element. In the year 1002, he obtained the fruit of his labours, the High Kingship. For the first time, Ireland would be ruled by one king who was more than a mere figurehead. All the petty kings would enforce his orders. He liberally endowed the scholastic and monastic institutions and sent emissaries to Europe to find and replace the tens of thousands of books that had been destroyed during Irish and Viking raids. He sought nothing less than to restore Ireland as the land of saints and scholars. 1 mile north of Killaloe is the site of an ancient fort. It was to here that Irishmen drove their cattle in order to pay their taxes to the king, for cattle was then the currency of Ireland. The Gaelic word for cattle tax was boruma, and it was through his association with this that Brian became known as Brian Boruma, or Brian Boru, as he is called today. The taxes gathered at places such as this led to unrest, and at the end of the year 1012, Leinster and Dublin began to rebel. A year later, at the age of 73, Brian Boru saw his life's work start to fall apart. The High King began to assemble his forces to meet the rebels, and on Good Friday of 1014, at Clontarf, near Dublin, his final battle commenced. He himself was too old to fight, but his troops won the battle. As he knelt in his tent and prayed thanks, a fleeing Viking chief came upon him and cleaved the bare head of the High King of Ireland. The 12 short years during which Brian Boru held the High Kingship are remembered here in Armagh, where the remains of his body were finally laid to rest. Brian Boru's reign was the only period in the whole history of this land that total unity and self-government prevailed over the entire island. Jerpoint Abbey in County Kilkenny is evidence of how things changed in the years following Boru's death. Although a strong monastic tradition continued, there was a significant change in direction. For this 12th century site was established by the Cistercians. Unlike earlier monastic settlements, which were centers of the community, those founded by the Cistercians were located at remote sites like this. This move away from a traditional Irish pattern reflected how the church in Ireland, previously so distinctive, was now beginning to follow a more Roman structure. Although prompted by 4 synods that were held in the first half of the 12th century, the growing influence of Rome reflects how the church, like the country itself, fell into disarray with the loss of a strong high kingship. Although there was no shortage of aspirants to Boru's crown, the incohesive nature of Irish society made it impossible for any of them to assert their authority.
The kingship didn't go on a primogeniture. It was actually within the clan, and anyone within second cousins of the king was eligible to be elected as king. And when the king died, then there was a meeting to elect a new king. It was a good system in the sense that you probably get better people appointed as king, but it was a very bad system for generating conflict. And it was one of the weaknesses of the Celtic civilization. The Romans made use of it, and the Normans' invasion of Ireland made use of that as well, because whenever a king died, a conflict or a potential conflict situation was created, and by manipulating that, outsiders could have a great effect on an area or on a country.
Although the inherent weaknesses of Celtic society made it easy for the Normans to gain a foothold in Ireland, the strength of its proudly assertive traditions meant that there would always be an undercurrent of resistance. And so the foundations were laid for the Anglo-Irish conflict that would dominate the story of Ireland. in the centuries ahead. The 12th century Gaelic society was culturally strong, but politically disunited by the feuding that still persisted between petty kings. The Normans, who had already conquered Britain, soon began to exploit this. Their first opportunity came when the King of Leinster, Dermot MacMurrough Kavanagh, based here at Ferns Abbey, stole the wife of another petty king, Tiernan O'Rourke of Breffni. In retaliation, Tiernan forced Dermot out of his headquarters in 1166. Seeking to rebuild his power base, Dermot sought allies among the Norman lords in Britain. It was here, at Bannow Bay, County Wexford, that, following an initial defeat by Tiernan in 1167, Dermot landed 2 years later with a small army provided by Richard Fitzgilbert, Earl of Pembroke. Pembroke, or Strongbow as he was known, gave his backing in return for the right to marry Dermot's daughter, Aoife, and in time succeed to the kingship of Leinster. And it was here, on the rock of Dunamace, southeast of Kildare, that he built his castle following the marriage. Hence it was by invitation that the Normans gained this first toehold in Ireland. Fortified castles continued to express the authority of the Norman lords as they developed a mighty power base. The largest and best preserved Norman castle in Ireland is that at Carrickfergus in Antrim. Dominating this pleasant seaside town on the north shore of Belfast Lough, it was built by the Anglo-Norman John de Courcy, and work started in 1177, soon after the arrival of the Normans. Norman castles began to occupy strategic positions all over Ireland, and nowhere more so than here in Kilkenny, which is dominated by its cathedral on one side and the castle that faces it on the other side of the city. Strategically located on the banks of the River Nore, Kilkenny soon became a major venue for Anglo-Irish parliaments and a centre for trade. Today it is still Ireland's finest example of a medieval city, with a wealth of historic buildings. It was from castles like that at Kilkenny that Norman families gradually built their power bases. Kilkenny Castle was the main seat of the Butler family, who lived here from the 14th century right through to 1935. The first butler was Theobald Fitzwalter, who came from Caen in Normandy, and was appointed Chief Butler of Ireland in 1177. As with other influential Norman families, the power that the Butlers acquired over Kilkenny was carefully cultivated over the 3 centuries following their arrival in Ireland. They arranged their marriages astutely, ensuring that they were represented on all sides of Ireland's political and religious struggles. Such intermarrying between the Norman Irish and the native Irish brought a gradual integration and growing independence from the English crown. As a result, at a parliament here in Kilkenny, on the very doorstep of the Butler family, the Statutes of Kilkenny were passed in 1366, with the aim of preventing Anglo-Normans from intermingling with the native Irish. However, the process had already gone too far for the new laws to be workable, and the barons continued to thrive as English influence shrank to an area around Dublin known as the Pale. Here in the middle of Ireland lie the counties of Laois and Offaly, whose names give a clue to what happened next. Laois stands for Queen's County, and Offaly means King's County. The king in question was himself related to the Butlers through his marriage to Anne Boleyn, granddaughter of Thomas Butler. Henry VIII, resolving to finally break the nobles' power, proclaimed himself King of this land of Ireland, as united, annexed and knit forever to the imperial crown of the realm of England. His plan for the nobles to surrender their lands to him and have them re-granted by the grace of the king failed when many simply refused. So he seized them anyway, and instead of re-granting them, instigated the first in a succession of planned colonizations by settling them with loyal planters from England. The story of Silken Thomas, still recalled here in Kildare, illustrates the precarious position in which many Irish nobles found themselves. Garret Fitzgerald, the 16th century Earl of Kildare and head of one of the two great branches of the Geraldine family, was obliged to make many visits to England to defend himself against charges of disloyalty, contrived by his Irish enemies. One such visit saw him imprisoned in the Tower of London, accused of being slow to arrest his kinsman, the Earl of Desmond, an alleged enemy of the king. Fitzgerald's son Thomas, known as Silken Thomas after the richness of his clothes and his fondness for silken banners, was barely 21 as he assumed authority in his father's absence. Swamped by rumours that the Earl had been beheaded, he declared, "I am no longer Henry Tudor's deputy, I am his foe." By the time the claims about the Earl's fate were found to be just one more plot to ruin the Geraldine family, it was too late for Thomas to retract his position. Silken Thomas himself was beheaded, and his father died in 1534 in his dungeon. One more victim of the power struggles that were taking place, not just with the king, but also within the Irish nobility itself.
The lady is going to kiss the bloody stone.
You dropped many down there?
Did you do it? Did you do it? Yay!
Well, we did it.
Ed finally relinquish your things.
That's right, bro. We've been there. Done it.
Every year, countless numbers come here to Blarney Castle, with just one thought in mind: to kiss the Blarney Stone. The legend is that those who do so will acquire the gift of eloquence.
Okay. Thank you.
As they wander through the fairy glens surrounding the castle, many may be unaware that Blarney is itself steeped in the battle to control Ireland in the 15th and 16th centuries. When the English crown passed to Henry VIII's daughter, Elizabeth I, the Queen ordered the Earl of Leicester to seize the castle from the rebellious McCarthy clan, who had built it in 1446. It is said that the Earl made numerous eloquent progress reports that actually said very little, prompting an outburst from the Queen that this is all Blarney. True or not, the popular appeal of kissing the stone is as resistant to challenge as the McCarthys were. For on this occasion, the Queen's efforts to remove them were frustrated. The Kerry town of Tralee is perhaps best known for the festival held every August, at which any girl of Irish descent can compete for the title Rose of Tralee. But it had a key role in Elizabeth I's struggles with the nobles. The town owes its origins to the other half of the Geraldine family that gave rise to the Silken Thomas episode. For it was on this site in 1243 that John Fitzgerald built an abbey. Tralee went on to become the principal seat of his descendants, who in 1355 received the title Earls of Desmond. Unlike the Earl of Kildare, who paid such a high price for his dealings with the crown, the Fitzgerald branch of the Geraldines were more outspoken, and in 1579 they challenged Elizabeth's authority in what became known as the Desmond Rebellion. The Queen severely crushed her opponents, and as had been the case in the past, confiscated and colonized the rebel land. The beneficiary of all this was a man after whom one of Tralee's handsome 18th century streets is named, Sir Henry Denny. The lands on which the town is built, having been taken away from the Desmonds, were granted to Denny in recognition of his service to the English crown in the massacre of 1580, in which the 15th Earl of Desmond was killed. The Dennys retained control of Tralee for the next 300 years. Step by step, the English crown was increasing its hold over Ireland. Ballinafad Castle, built in 1590 to protect the Curlews mountain pass, is one of the many monuments to this. Only 9 years after its construction, the forces of Hugh Roe O'Donnell defeated the English in what became known as the Battle of the Curlews. But as the sun set on the mountains, it was also drawing an era to an end, for this was to be the last Irish victory in the Elizabethan campaign. Overlooking the broad estuary of the River Bandon, Kinsale is now better known for tourism, yachting and deep-sea fishing. Its winter population of around 2,000 people is swelled each summer by the many thousands who come to explore its small, winding streets. The Kinsale area's location on Ireland's southern coast means that proximity to Europe has been a major influence over the centuries. This is reflected in the magnificent Georgian houses and the Dutch character of much of its architecture. Another significant building is Desmond Castle. It was built in the 16th century as a residence for the Earls of Desmond, but for a brief time in 1601 it was occupied by the Spanish, who used it as a store for ammunition. That the Spanish should show any interest in Kinsale helps explain why Elizabeth I fought so strongly to control Ireland. Although partly motivated by a desire to impose the Reformation, she was also concerned to prevent Spain, England's largest enemy at the time, from using Ireland as a base from which to attack. Great rivalry existed between England and Spain. The issue was who would dominate the seas, but the prize was the ability to found new colonies. Also, in the light of the Reformation, England was now broadly identified with the Protestant cause, whilst Spain represented Catholicism. The Irish nobles were adept at exploiting these differences to further their own cause. And it is in this context that a Spanish force arrived here in Kinsale in 1601. An allegiance with Spain had been formed by a particularly powerful baron, Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, who claimed to be fighting for the Catholic cause in Ireland. O'Neill was based in the north of Ireland and had requested a Spanish landing closer to his power base. The motives of the Spanish leader, Don Juan de Aguirre, in landing over 3,000 troops this far south are unclear. But when they arrived, they found the townspeople, although loyal to the English, willing to cooperate with them. The Spanish forces controlled Kinsale town for 100 days before the English armies arrived under the command of Lord Mountjoy and began to win back strategic positions, including the harbour. Realizing the Spanish were under siege, Hugh O'Neill and his ally Hugh O'Donnell led their armies on a remarkable march across the length of Ireland in order to support the Spanish. It was here, just outside the town at Millwater, that a fierce battle took place between the 5,000 Irish troops and around 3,000 English. The balance of the English army was used to maintain the siege against the Spanish, ensuring they would take no part in the fighting. The Battle of Kinsale lasted just 3 hours and cost over 1,000 Irish lives. The English suffered relatively few casualties and offered the Spanish an honourable surrender and safe conduct home, which they had little choice but to accept. For the Irish, the consequences were much worse. In what has become known as the Flight of the Earls, O'Donnell went to Spain for help, but died there. With no support from home or abroad, O'Neill surrendered in 1603, the day before Queen Elizabeth died. O'Neill's defeat signalled the end of the old Gaelic order. The system of kingship, family ties and customs that had been handed down from the days of Tara was now gone forever. Evidence of the tightening English hold on Ireland can be found in Kinsale itself. Built soon after the battle to strengthen the town's defences, James Fort takes its name from James I, who had by then acceded to the English throne. To complete the defence of the harbour, Charles Fort was built on the other side of the Bandon estuary in around 1677. Although it has undergone many changes since, it is a potent reminder of the long era of English colonial rule that ensued, for it continued to be garrisoned until 1922. It was in the aftermath of the Flight of the Earls that the seeds were sown for a conflict that even today is not totally resolved. Following O'Neill's surrender and subsequent exile, King James I saw the time was right to bring the Gaelic Irish lords into line. By depriving them of their land, he could also remove their power. And so he began a series of plantations, whereby Protestants from England and Scotland were resettled on land confiscated from the Irish aristocrats. The modern Irish Republic comprises only 26 of the 32 counties of Ireland. The remaining 6 counties of Ulster form part of the United Kingdom. The border area between Ulster and the Republic offers little evidence that a border exists at all, and the dividing line has so little contemporary relevance that a man sleeping in his own house may find that his head is in the United Kingdom, whilst his feet are in the Republic. However, there is an historic relevance, for although it was 321 years after the Battle of Kinsale that the partitioning of Ireland took place, the 6 counties of modern Ulster occupy the very lands that were taken from the Gaelic earls. In the wake of the Ulster plantations, the outlook for the Gaelic lords was as desolate as the landscape that characterises Ulster's Sperrin Mountains. But the plantations also devastated peasants, who lost the property rights they had held under ancient Gaelic law. The resentment felt by both classes provoked an obsession with land ownership that would figure prominently in Irish politics for the next 300 years. Mainly to the north of the mountains lies County Londonderry, an area immortalised in the name of the famous Ayr. The song was written in 1851 by Jane Ross, who lived here at Main Street in Limavady. In common with many of the towns in County Londonderry, Limavady owes much to the plantations, for it was refounded by Sir Thomas Phillips, chief agent for the City of London in Ulster. The London livery companies played a major role because most of the confiscated land was parcelled out to them, and they established numerous towns and villages. Sometimes their influence is clear from place names. In other cases, such as the village of Ballykelly, which was created by the Fishmongers Company, it is the buildings that reflect the livery company's influence. For in establishing places such as this, the livery companies introduced many of the innovative new planning ideas that were current at the time. In the case of Ballykelly, they built a model farm. Today, it serves as a hospital, but the basic design remains unaltered. The church building that stands opposite the farm, although not built until the 19th century, nevertheless reveals another aspect of the plantations. For in addition to those who were officially resettled by the authorities, the new opportunities offered by a new land encouraged the unsponsored migration of working-class Presbyterians from Scotland. This created a potent mix, for it effectively imported the religious conflict between the Anglican and Presbyterian branches of Protestantism that was already underway in Britain. This influx of new population meant that even the non-Gaelic lords, descendants of the Normans who had arrived from England, were no longer secure in their castles. Now known as the Old English, they were not considered completely Irish, nor were they totally accepted by the English establishment. Therefore, they were vulnerable to New English discoverers, whose efforts in finding defects in native Irish land titles resulted in land forfeitures to the Crown. By 1641, Charles I had acceded to the English throne and had become involved in a bitter power struggle with Parliament. Seizing their chance, on the 22nd of October that year, the native Irish rose up in an attempt to regain their lands lost in the plantations. Led by Sir Phelim O'Neill, they quickly gained control of most of central Ulster. Some Gaelic leaders, such as Owen Roe O'Neill, returned from exile on the continent to take part as the rising spread throughout Ireland. Phelim O'Neill claimed that he was simply supporting the king in his struggle with Parliament, which pressured the Old English, with their royalist leanings, to join the Gaelic forces in an uneasy alliance. As the rebellion broadened, so did its aims, as it grew into a defense of Catholicism in general. The execution of Charles I in 1649 left no doubt about how things were moving in England. Parliament's army, led by the Protestant Oliver Cromwell, had emerged victorious from the power struggle there. For the Catholics still rebelling in Ireland, the consequences were catastrophic. Nowhere was this more clearly felt than here in Drogheda. Its strategic importance is based on its position as a gateway town, facing the English mainland on one side and guarding the estuary of the River Boyne on the other. It is on the steep north bank of this historic river that the town centre is built on several levels. And it was here that in 1649, following the abolition of the monarchy and the execution of the king, that Cromwell's army embarked upon a massacre, where it slaughtered 2,000 of the town's garrison and inhabitants. The Irish Catholics were made to pay the price for their years of revolt, as the new Puritan Parliament decreed the absolute suppression of Catholicism in Ireland. What happened here in Drogheda was but one chapter in a lengthy saga of events that saw Ireland devastated by Cromwell's 20,000-strong army. By 1652, about a third of the Catholic Irish had been killed, and much of their land handed over to Protestants. When Charles II came to power following the eventual restoration of the English monarchy, Irish Catholics were at first hopeful, and indeed some of their lands were returned to them. But there was little fundamental change, since the new king depended on the Protestants for his power. It was Charles' successor, James II, who brought the Catholics real cause for optimism, for he was himself a Catholic. He raised hopes by introducing an Act of Parliament intended to oust the Protestant settlers. But the English establishment, alarmed at what they saw as James' popish ways, turned to William of Orange. James was forced into exile, but his Catholic army in Ireland remained intact. In an effort to regain his throne, James promptly began recruiting new Irish and French troops, shrewdly exploiting Irish resentment over land, promising that if his war were successful, they would recover their lands and power. The events that followed had an impact on one place in particular that still resonates today. Derry, or Londonderry as it came to be called, originally developed in the 12th century. It grew up alongside a monastery founded by St. Columcille, in an oak grove alongside the River Foyle. Indeed, its name derives from the Irish word dara, meaning oak grove. The original town was destroyed by fire in 1608, when a local chieftain, Caer O'Doherty, led a rebellion against the mayor. This left the way open for it to be completely redesigned as part of the Ulster plantations. The history of Derry is imaginatively and even-handedly presented at the city's Tower Museum, where great care has been taken to encompass all traditions.
Derry has always had a strategic importance for the control of the northwest of Ulster in general, and as such it was deemed extremely important as part of the plantation scheme to make sure that that area was secured. Therefore, a scheme was drawn up to build a new city or fortified area in the region. The city itself was revolutionary in the sense it was the first piece of urban design or planned urban design in Ireland, and the model or template that was used for it was transported later to the Americas, Philadelphia being a good example of that. In essence, the whole idea was to ensure the control of Ulster was not lost again after the previous experiences and the length that the Elizabethans went to secure it.
The determination of the English to ensure the security of Derry is reflected in the 20 feet thick city walls, which were built between 1613 and 1618.
The plantation was a hugely expensive scheme, and if you want, the creation of a new city was obviously going to add more to that. The merchant companies in London were given the authority to build the city, and it was their contribution, both financial and in resources, that created the development of this modern 17th century city. Consequently, the town of Derry was given a charter as a city in 1613 and renamed Londonderry, and the prefix was simply in deference or respect to the contribution made by the London companies.
To the Protestant English establishment of the 1600s, the new city of Londonderry was the jewel in the crown of the Ulster plantations, and the original street layout survives virtually unchanged to the present day. At the heart of the walled city is an area called the Diamond. At the time when the new city was built, this term was widely used in this region of Ulster to describe the open central space of a settlement. The planning ideals of the 17th century are clearly visible here, for when standing in the Diamond, all four gates in the walls can be seen at the ends of the streets leading off the square. The plantation origins of the new city are evident through St. Colum's Cathedral. Constructed between 1628 and 1633, this was the first Protestant cathedral built in the British Isles after the Reformation. It is undoubtedly one of the most important 17th century buildings in the country, but interestingly, does not reflect the balance of Derry's population at the time of its construction. In the mid-1630s, Anglican English settlers here were outnumbered 20-1 by settlers from Scotland, who were mainly Presbyterian. This fine church, therefore, reflected the religious persuasions of the city's leading figures of the time, rather than the beliefs of the ordinary citizens. Initially, the economic expansion of Londonderry was quite slow. By the 1680s, there were still only about 2,000 inhabitants, although this was sufficient to make it by far the largest town in Ulster. And it was here that the exiled King James' efforts to regain his throne led to an episode that would resound for centuries to come. In 1688, a garrison of the Irish and French troops recruited by James was sent to take over this plantation city. The governor of Derry at the time, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Lundy, favoured capitulation. He recommended that 2 English regiments and key officers leave the city in order to appease the enemy. But instead of appeasement, there was resistance, the nature of which is alluded to by the name of this building, the Apprentice Boys' Hall. A group of the Protestant apprentice boys of Londonderry feared that the approaching Catholic troops were about to slaughter the local population. Therefore, in December 1688, as James' regiment approached, 13 apprentices arrived here at the Ferry Quay gate and slammed it shut in the face of the arriving soldiers. This act of defiance was exacerbated when the Protestant inhabitants of the city and the thousands of Protestants who had fled here for refuge declared their support for William of Orange. On April the 18th, 1689, James himself came to the city with a 20,000-strong army and demanded its surrender. And so began the siege of Londonderry, which was to last for 105 days. In May, James' supporters constructed a floating barricade across the River Foyle, keeping supply ships at bay for 7 weeks. But this city of walls and watchtowers was designed to be impenetrable, and, as the cannons that still sit astride its fortifications amply demonstrate, was well armed. Cannonballs rained down from both directions, and starvation and disease spread. By the 10th of July, the siege was still continuing, and James' men fired a shell into the city bearing the terms for surrender. It was from here, at the Royal Bastion, that there came a response that has echoed through the history of Ulster ever since. No surrender. About 2 weeks later, the Mountjoy and other ships arrived to relieve the city, smashing through the boom that lay across the river. the army of King James retreated and the siege was finally over. At the start of the siege, 30,000 had stood defiant within the city's walls. When it ended 15 weeks later, on the 28th of July, 1689, around 7,000 of them had starved to death. Those who survived the siege were in no mood to forgive Governor Lundy, who had secretly escaped in disguise. To this day, he is branded a traitor, as Ulster Protestants burn his effigy each year. The very mortar shell that was fired into the city containing the terms for surrender now stands in the porch of St. Colum's Cathedral. It is a vivid reminder of the lasting impact the siege has had on this city. One that continues to be felt even in the present day. Despite his retreat from Londonderry, James had far from given up the struggle against William of Orange. But the next encounter would prove a turning point. On a steep hill above a bridge across this river stands the beautiful old village of Slane. On the outskirts of this picturesque place is the Hill of Slane, where St. Patrick proclaimed Christianity in Ireland by lighting a paschal fire in the year 433. It is doubtful that St. Patrick could have foreseen how, just a few miles from where it was proclaimed, centuries later, so much blood would be shed in the name of that very religion. For, in the year following the siege of Londonderry, it was across these waters that James II came face to face with William of Orange at the Battle of the Boyne. William landed in Ireland in June 1690, after his troops had already secured Ulster and spent the winter reinforcing. As William led his men towards Dublin, James's army withdrew to the south bank of the Boyne. As battle commenced at this place on the Boyne on the 1st of July of that year, William's army of 36,000 was already 10,000 the stronger. Its numerical superiority increased as William's tactics forced James to divert troops from the main arena. By mid-afternoon, the Jacobites were in retreat, with James himself riding to Dublin to warn of William's approach. Defeat at the Battle of the Boyne saw James immediately flee back to France, effectively abandoning his claim to the throne. The final Irish surrender came in 1691, after the siege of Limerick. At the heart of the events that resulted was that recurring Irish preoccupation, land. With William anxious to deploy his troops in the war against France, the Treaty of Limerick was surprisingly generous to the defeated Catholics. But the various concessions were omitted from the formal document presented to Parliament. Instead, penal laws were introduced, ensuring that Catholics would become a persecuted majority in Ireland. They were barred from public life and not allowed to buy or profitably rent land. When a Catholic landowner died, instead of going to his eldest son, his land was divided between all his sons, unless one turned Protestant, in which case he got it all. This, along with a third and final wave of 17th century plantations, meant that by the mid-18th century, only 7% of land was in Catholic hands. Castletown House in County Kildare, Ireland's first great Palladian mansion, built in 1722, is nothing less than a monument to the increasing disparity in power and wealth that enveloped Ireland. It was commissioned by William Connolly, a lawyer from Ballyshannon. He eventually became known as Speaker Connolly, for in 1692 he became MP for Donegal, and in 1715 was elected Speaker of the Irish House of Commons. The wealth that made it possible for him to indulge in the opulence of this house was acquired through dealing in the Catholic estates that were forfeited through the penal laws that followed the Battle of the Boyne. This aristocratic ruling class enjoyed a party-oriented life on estates such as this, pursued a respectable professional career in law, government, education, or the military, and above all, collected high rents from its Irish tenants. Although often referred to as the Protestant ascendancy, this elite was in fact Anglican-dominated. The Presbyterians who had arrived from Scotland during the plantations distanced themselves from the Anglicans, adhering to their Scottish cultural origins. Congregated in places like Londonderry, close-knit and industrious, they pursued a middle-class existence in business and farming. They became a self-reliant community within a larger society. And this too would have repercussions in future years. Presbyterians played no small part in creating the wealth that Londonderry began to enjoy. The many fine Georgian-style houses that still exist today bear witness to this wealth. Although the numerous prosperous Presbyterian merchants were spared many of the restrictions imposed on Catholics, they were required to tithe to the Anglican Church of Ireland, and were also debarred from holding government office. This proved so demoralizing that large numbers of them went off to start a new life in North America. Much of the prosperity enjoyed by those who remained was brought about by the arrival of the shirt-making industry around 1830. Signs of the commercial wealth that this created here can still be found in the ornamental facades of the shirt-making factories that provided employment for generations. A further expression of this wealth is the Guildhall, erected in 1890. It clearly shows the influence of the London merchants. However, wealth was far from evenly spread, and emigration continued through the 19th century, although by then it was mainly Catholics who were leaving. This in turn gave rise to a new industry, as Derry became one of Ireland's most important embarkation points for emigrants setting out for America. Ironically, it was this latest exodus that helped swell and change the nature of the city's population, because not every would-be emigrant made it past the harbour.
Most of the people, the emigre population who were coming into the city were poor Catholics, and that effectively changed the whole demography of the city. In essence, within a 20-year period, a lot of the industry and trade and businesses in the city changed hands, and the Derry, or Londonderry that we know today, is a nationalist town, owing its roots to those causes, going right back to the siege.
Destined to become a characteristic of Irish life, large-scale emigration began in the 17th century, when up to 100,000 people departed for the North American colonies. By 1776, that number had grown by 4 or 5 times. Despite the overall increase in emigration in the 18th century, the proportion of Catholic emigrants fell to no more than 25%. This is partly because the American colonies were English and Protestant, so little appeared to be gained from leaving. Not that Catholics had much to gain from remaining in Ireland. They were little more than slaves. Despite this, they did not see the English king as their enemy. Indeed, the minority of Catholics who attained gentry status actually supported the king, reaffirming their allegiance to George III when the American colonies declared their independence in 1776. The hatred was reserved for the landlords. It was expressed across the land as violent groups of young men began riding out at night, maiming landlords' cattle and shooting through windows. The life of the ascendancy class in Dublin was far removed from the hardships of the land. But here too there was discontent. St. Patrick's Cathedral was founded by John Comyn in the 12th century, on the site of a holy well where converts were allegedly once baptized by St. Patrick. After Comyn's death, the church was promoted to a cathedral and replaced by a new building dedicated in 1254. From 1713 to 1745, Jonathan Swift, the author of Gulliver's Travels, was Dean of St. Patrick's. And it was from here that he expressed his anger at the poverty and inequality of Ireland. He urged his countrymen to burn everything English except their coal, and in his satire, A Modest Proposal, he suggested that poor Irish children might be fattened and slaughtered as tasty joints for rich people's tables. But it was another of his proposals that would shortly become a reality. He put forward the notion of a separate Irish Parliament that would still be loyal to the king, but in his role as King of Ireland rather than King of England. Swift's was not an isolated voice. There was a wider feeling that Ireland's economy was being stifled by trade restrictions imposed by Westminster to suit its own interests. Among those pushing for more autonomy was a Protestant group known as the Patriots, who believed a reformed assembly would enhance Irish commerce, as well as preserve Protestant interests. As Ireland's ascendancy class came to regard themselves as Irish rather than British, they reflected the general climate of thought at the time, which was influenced by something going on far from the shores of Ireland: the American Revolution. Aware of an intensifying British nationalism that regarded them as colonial inferiors, the inhabitants of the American colonies were increasingly adopting an identity independent of the mother country. Ireland's ascendancy class saw themselves as sharing a common cause with the Americans. The withdrawal of British troops from Ireland to deal with the rebellions in the American colonies gave those in Ireland who identified with the American Revolution a chance of their own. In 1778, they established their own citizen army. Mainly Protestant and middle class, the Irish Volunteers quickly developed as a paramilitary pressure group. By 1782, they were 80,000 strong, and their influence was crucial in furthering the aims of the Protestant Patriots. It was in that year that the Patriots, led by Henry Grattan, saw their efforts rewarded. London gave way, and this building became home to an independent legislature under allegiance to the king. It became known as Grattan's Parliament, after the Patriot leader. Despite the apparent confidence of the Irish ascendancy class as they boldly assembled in their new parliament, English patronage and influence remained paramount. Infamous as the instruments of this patronage were the so-called Three Jacks: John Foster, Speaker of the Irish Parliament; John Beresford, who became known as the King of Ireland through his control of patronage; and John Fitzgibbon, who was the first Irishman to become Lord Chancellor. Between them, these men effectively managed the Irish Parliament, cynically serving the English interest in Ireland to enhance their own careers. Under such circumstances, the prospect for further reforms and freedoms was at best limited. Exactly how limited would become clear in a mere 20 years' time. Dublin, the capital of modern Ireland, and a mixture of the jovial and the jaded, the thriving and the threadbare. The city's history of occupation is encapsulated by Christ Church Cathedral. The site was given over to religion under the Vikings, acquired its first stone church under the Normans, and now has a cathedral under the Anglicans. Despite the long history that places like Christ Church embody, it was long after the sun had set on Ireland's golden age of Celtic greatness that Dublin saw its own halcyon days. Towards the end of the 18th century, with legislative independence established and trade restrictions eased, nobles and men of property were drawn to the city. Their wealth accelerated Dublin's expansion north of the River Liffey. The boom in trade is reflected in buildings like the Custom House, completed in 1791 by James Gandon. Gandon's vision is reflected in many aspects of Dublin's 18th century development, including the King's Inns, the Dublin Inns of Court where barristers used to live as well as study. It is the last great public building he designed. Fine new terraces were built, such as Henrietta Street. These were complemented by elegant squares. The fashionable residential district that grew up on the north bank of the River Liffey in the 18th century was centred on a major thoroughfare. Today we know this as O'Connell Street. Rebuilt after the Civil War, it is a mixture of the old and the modern. Nevertheless, its elegance has not been totally obscured, and the statues that still line its centre remind us of the importance it assumed following Dublin's 18th century expansion to the north. Within decades, the city began to spread back across the river, to the east of the old city. The Duke of Leinster built the first nobleman's house south of the river in the 1750s. Today, Leinster House is Ireland's Parliament building. Like Leinster House, the elegant squares reflect the names of the aristocrats who inhabited them. One of Dublin's finest is Merrion Square. The profusion of commemorative plaques that adorn the walls of the square reveal just how fashionable it became among the great and the good. The shaping of the Dublin we see today owes much to the favourable conditions that existed in the period following the establishment of Grattan's Parliament. Even that oppressed majority, Catholics, gained limited voting rights and the right to buy land. But the Catholic poor were denied any real political role. It was in this climate that in 1791, Theobald Wolfe Tone, a Protestant coach builder's son from Belfast, set up the Society of United Irishmen Club in his home city. A second soon opened in Dublin. The leadership of the United Irishmen reflected the three-tier society that had resulted from the 17th century plantations and the penal laws. Most of the leaders in Ulster were Presbyterians, whilst the leadership in what is now the Republic was mainly Anglican Protestant.
I think the main idea was it was at a time when ideas were floating around Europe to a huge degree, and republicanism, the rights of man, and democracy even, non-sectarianism, these were all very attractive ideas for the people who had received most, because of the penal laws, most education who were Protestant.
The inspiration for these ideas was the French Revolution. It threw into question the notion of sectarianism aimed at marginalizing Catholics, by demonstrating that Catholics could be safely admitted as citizens. The United Irishmen proclaimed three specific aims: to transcend anti-popery, to achieve fully fledged separation from the British monarchy, and to accord parity of esteem to indigenous, pre-colonial Irish culture. William Pitt, the British Prime Minister, grudgingly tolerated the United Irishmen until 1793, when war broke out between Britain and France. Fearing an Irish alliance with the French, he immediately suppressed the organization. Unlike their counterparts in the south, the non-Presbyterian Protestants in Ulster found themselves in opposition to the United Irishmen's ideals. It was here at Loch Gall that a fight took place between two vigilante groups, the Protestant Peeper Day Boys and the Catholic Defenders. The root of the dispute was the Catholic Relief Acts, which increased the competition for tenancies and fired Protestant fears that they would be underbid. 30 men died in what has become known as the Battle of the Diamond. Following the battle in September 1795, it was in this farmhouse near the site of the fighting that the Protestants founded an organization with the intention of frightening Catholics out of the district. The Orange Order, as it was called after William of Orange, underlined the distinctive character of Ulster Protestants. But it would nevertheless influence events outside Ulster in the years ahead. Meanwhile, following their suppression, the United Irishmen had begun regrouping. It was here at Bantry Bay in 1796 that they launched their first attempt to strike back. Wolfe Tone, who had fled to America, had been persuaded to forego his plans to be a farmer in Philadelphia and instead to go to France to rally support against Britain. The French, anxious to injure their great enemy, were convinced by Tone that the Irish were ready to rise up and fight, and dispatched a 43-strong battle fleet on December the 16th, 1796.
The French were landing, I presume, not so much to set up the great Irish Republic. They were landing because they saw armed rebellion in Ireland as being a very useful way to distract an England with which they were at war and had been at war for a while. So Ireland, I suppose, to some degree, was part of the European power game.
Severe storms dispersed the fleet, but some troops did land here at Bantry Bay. What they encountered was not a fighting force of Irishmen, but ragged, unenthusiastic peasants. Ironically, these peasants believed that the French had been sent by the northern Protestants to suppress them further. Although the landing at Bantry Bay had failed, it prompted the British to devise a stronger security policy to cope with the United Irishmen and a potential French invasion. This left the southeast of the country almost bereft of troops, and aware that fears about the Orangemen could only strengthen their support from ordinary Catholics, the United Irishmen devised a daring plan to strike at Dublin itself, independent of French help. And so it was that in 1798, the United Irishmen launched what we now know as the Great Rebellion.
The rebellion came about because, although they had planned one, generally the authorities took a preemptive strike. They tried to put down the rebellion in the north, which they did very successfully. When it rose, it was only really a shadow of what it could have been. And Wexford then, which was quite a quiet county, which had only very recently been organised by the United Irishmen, was where the rising began, and mainly because there were genuine fears among the population there about the fate of the government and the Orangemen, although the Orangemen weren't very prevalent there, what the Orangemen had in store for them.
The county of Wexford in the southeast is the part of Ireland that is nearest to mainland Europe. Its magnificent beaches make it a favourite holiday area for Dubliners. But the peace that greets today's visitors could not be further removed from the turbulence of the Great Rebellion in 1798. But what did it achieve?
Initially, great success. United Irishmen on the field were generally extraordinarily brave individuals. They felt, whatever the reasons were for the rising, that this was one of their chances, their main chances. And to a degree, Protestant and Catholic were involved. On either side, you had many loyalist Catholics and you had many Republican and Protestants, so it was an interesting time that way.
The town of Wexford itself will forever be associated with the United Irishmen's initial success. With its narrow streets and alleyways, Wexford sits on the south bank at the mouth of the River Slaney. Today it is internationally known for its opera festival, which features some of the lesser-known works of the great composers. Its strong cultural tradition is equalled by its long maritime tradition. The shipping trade was built up in the 19th century, which saw the growth of many local companies. But overlooking the harbour is a reminder that the town's seafaring connections go back even further. The statue that gazes across the waters is that of John Barry, Senior Commodore of the United States Navy from 1794 to 1803. Barry was born at Ballysampson in County Wexford. At the heart of Wexford's quaint centre is the bull ring, which was once used for bull baiting, a popular sport among the Norman nobles who arrived here after the Vikings. But it is another statue that reminds us of the Great Rebellion. The memorial in the town centre depicts a pikeman, a name given to the rebels after their weapons. So great was their initial success that they held Wexford for a month, until it was recaptured by Crown forces. Following its recapture, so many of the United Irishmen's leaders were arrested that most of the risings that ensued elsewhere were ill-organized and failed. It was further north at Enniscorthy that the rebels took their last stand. Enniscorthy has two outstanding public buildings. St. Aidan's Cathedral, built between 1843 and 1846, stands on the site of the former parish church. The town's other architectural gem is the castle, which dates from 1586. And it is here in the 1798 room that many of the weapons used by the pikemen are preserved. In overall command of the British Army was Lord Cornwallis, who had earlier led the British to defeat in the American War of Independence. This time, he would make no such mistake. The setting for the final battle of the Great Rebellion was just outside the town, at Vinegar Hill. The rebels held this site for a month. 20,000 of them, accompanied by women and children, faced an equal number of English troops led by General Lake.
The rebellion of 1798 was indeed a precursor and helped to shape and form much of what happened in the 19th century. It was a bloody rebellion which left maybe 30,000 people dead, up to that figure, in the space of about 3 months, and obviously left a residue of bitterness.
The rebels met their final defeat on the 21st of June, 1798. The Great Rebellion was over, but its influence would live on. As the French Revolution degenerated into a reign of terror, the United Irishmen became divided amongst themselves. Some United Irishmen argued for indigenous insurrection, whilst Tone and others saw the French as absolutely necessary to discipline the unreliable and possibly bloody Irish Catholics. North Mayo is the most remote and least inhabited region of Ireland. 400 square miles of it covered in blanket bog, a form of peat composed of dead grasses and sedges that formed through the high rainfall and humidity springing from the mighty Atlantic to the west. The centre of the region is dominated by the Neffen Beg range of mountains, with their dark, heather-clad slopes. Further north, the coastline with its dramatic cliffs is scarcely less desolate. This faraway corner of Ireland, a forgotten wilderness out of sight and out of mind, is an ideal place to enter unnoticed. And in August 1798, that is exactly what just over 1,000 French revolutionaries did. Urged on by Wolfe Tone, Napoleon Bonaparte saw that it would be to their benefit if the French could declare an Irish republic. It was here at Kilcummin that the troops he dispatched stepped ashore, under the leadership of General Humbert. Swelled by a growing band of enthusiastic but ill-equipped Irishmen of dubious fighting ability, the French advanced inland. As they progressed, it was here at Killala, in 1798, that the Republic of Ireland was first proclaimed, and John Moore was named as the first president. But it was another town, Ballina, the largest in North Mayo, that was the first to fall. Humbert's band of French and Irishmen advanced inland. In the shadow of the Neffenbeg Mountains stands Castlebar, the county town of Mayo. As this monument testifies, this is the burial place of John Moore. But it might also have been the burial place of the French general and his men. For waiting for them when they arrived in the town was the same General Lake who had earlier quashed the Great Rebellion at Vinegar Hill. His force of militia and yeomanry was vastly superior to that of Humbert's. But despite this, when battle commenced, it was the French who caused the rout. General Lake's cavalry was forced to retreat, and as it stampeded away, the spectacle earned a never-to-be-forgotten description: the Races of Castlebar. Following their day at the races, Humbert's band of French and Irishmen enjoyed a third victory over the English before moving south, with the intention of joining up with the United Irishmen. But Wolfe Tone's men had already been defeated. The same fate awaited Humbert's forces at Ballinamuck, where the French were taken prisoner and the Irish were hanged as traitors. The attempt to remove Ireland from English sway had failed. But Wolfe Tone has never been forgotten. He lived bravely but died humbly. Wolfe Tone spent his last days in prison, following an attempted suicide. Perhaps the most significant legacy of 1798 is that, for the first time, the notion of an Irish patriotism independent of England had taken root. It was a turning point that was pivotal to modern Ireland, marking the decisive moment when the two main political traditions of Ireland, nationalism and unionism, split. Overlooking College Green in Dublin stands one of the city's finest buildings, the Bank of Ireland. Fittingly, the three statues above the pediment represent Hibernia, standing between fidelity and commerce. They are a statement of lofty idealism. This is no accident, for it was designed to house the Irish Parliament. But it was not destined to fulfill this role for long. The 1798 rebellion had convinced the British Prime Minister, William Pitt, that only complete political union with Britain could render Ireland stable. Therefore, he proposed that the Irish Parliament should be abolished, and that Irish representatives would take 100 seats in the Imperial Parliament in London. At first, the Irish Parliament voted by a majority of 5 against the Union. But bribes, such as offers of peerages and offices of state, changed all that. On January the 1st, 1801, the union with Britain was officially formed. It was 2 years later that this fine building was converted for the use of the Bank of Ireland. In future, it would serve the interests of finance rather than democracy, not unlike some of those who caused its original purpose to be abandoned.
The Act of Union since then has been seen very much as the suppression of Irish rights by England, so on, so on. But it's interesting to point out that in 1800, when the Act of Union were passed, Roman Catholics, or the great majority of them, are the ones who were thinking and talking, and the ones who were heard and noted. We don't, of course, know very much about what ordinary people thought anyway, but certainly the Roman Catholic hierarchy were, I think, by and large, very much in favour of the Act of Union, because they saw the Act of Union as something that would get them out from under the heels of what they perceived to be their oppressors.
Catholic support for the Union was based on the promises made at the time that it would be accompanied by emancipation for this still suppressed majority. However, in the event, such promises came to nothing.
The Act of Union, I think, it's very easy to talk in hindsight and pontificate from 100, 200 years on, but if the Act of Union had come with emancipation for the country's Roman Catholic majority, I think things might have panned out quite differently, but it didn't. So there was another level of disillusionment created upon the bitterness and suppression of the 18th century.
To add to the disillusionment, an end to protective legislation and a wider Europe recession caused the Irish economy to seriously decline following the Union. In these harsh times, practical attempts at rebellion were thin on the ground. But there was one exception. When Robert Emmet, a Protestant from Cork and the son of the state surgeon, returned from France in 1802, his plan was to seize Dublin Castle, the seat of British administrative power in Ireland. In the event, 30 people were killed, and Emmet himself was soon captured.
One of the reasons that his legacy is so enduring really is because of a speech from the dock he gave, which is very, very moving. He wasn't alone of the patriots at that time who gave such speeches, but his was aspirational. It asked in the end that his memory lie in obscurity until other men at other times would take up his cause again. So it was almost a clarion call to future generations, and it had a profound effect on individuals right through history.
As he stood in the dock, condemned to be hanged, drawn and quartered, Emmet proclaimed, "Let no man write my epitaph. When my country takes her place among the nations of the earth, then, and not till then, let my epitaph be written." Over a century would pass before the dawning of that time. A century in which the struggle for independence was expressed not only through physical force, but also political action. One of the most prominent constitutional nationalists was Daniel O'Connell. A Catholic lawyer from Kerry, he was born here at Carham House in Cahersiveen, now little more than a ruin. Unlike most Catholics, he came from a well-off family that had acquired its wealth through trade. His personal life was far removed from the poverty of many of his compatriots. In 1825, he inherited the house and lands that now form Kerry's Derrynane National Park. The south and east wings still appear much as they did when O'Connell added them to the house. Today, Derrynane contains many mementos of his life, and its fine rooms and furnishings give an insight into the opulence O'Connell enjoyed. Like many people from such a background, he was educated in France and inspired by the ideals of the French Revolution. With his brilliant legal mind, he sought to achieve change by using rather than breaking the law. Although he wished to see the Union repealed, the first priority of his Catholic Association was to campaign for the right of Catholics to become members of Parliament. A measure of his success is the statue in the centre of Ennis, county town of Clare. For when he put himself forward as a candidate in 1828, he gained an overwhelming victory. At first, as a Catholic, he was unable to take his seat. But the scale of his support forced the British Prime Minister, Robert Peel, to introduce the Catholic Emancipation Bill, passed in 1829. Now able to enter the House of Commons, O'Connell, the uncrowned King of Ireland, as he was known, used his new position to push for repeal of the Union. But Parliament showed little interest in his cause, and as a result, O'Connell tried to rally the people directly. Tuam is one of the many places where rallies were held. As 30,000 people gathered, a Union Jack flew from the cathedral spire. It was a sign that O'Connell remained loyal to both king and empire, and wished only that Ireland could run its own internal affairs. The oratory of O'Connell, delivered in the shadow of Tuam Cathedral, was warlike, but his message was that there must be no violence. Robert Peel's British government was less than convinced that he meant this, and banned a rally at Clontarf. For a short time, in 1844, O'Connell was locked up on a sedition charge. Following his release, O'Connell built this chapel adjoining his house as a thanksgiving for the return of his freedom. Again back in the tranquility of his home, he began planning the next stage in his campaign for peaceful and democratic change. But something happened which rendered this ideal hopeless. It was 1845, and across the land the Irish peasantry were living, as Sir Walter Scott had once put it, on the extreme verge of human misery. Their survival had come to depend on a single crop, the potato. The potato appeared in Ireland with the colonization of the late 16th and early 17th centuries. The man responsible for introducing it is strongly connected with the town of Youghal in County Cork. Throughout Youghal there is evidence of its historically strategic position as a seaport. The town's vulnerability to invasion from France and Spain made it one of England's most strongly defended Irish ports, and in the 13th century led to it being enclosed by the impressive town walls. Today, they are among the best preserved town walls in Ireland. It is said that sailors from Youghal could recognize each other in any port in the world by their distinctive whistle. It is fitting then that in the 16th century, one of the world's most famous sailors was also Mayor of Youghal. And it was he, Sir Walter Raleigh, who, returning from his exploits in America, brought the potato back with him. The potato rapidly became the principal food of the poor. This was mainly because, being concealed underground, it was one of the few crops able to survive the devastation wrought on Ireland by the armies of James I, William III, and Cromwell. By 1845, the Irish poor were more dependent than ever on this humble crop, as their lives plunged to new depths of squalor. Just as this was happening and life was at its hardest, nature dealt her own crushing blow. Not once, but several times the potato crop was hit by blight. One of the many places in the west of Ireland where this was so is the Strokestown Park Estate in County Roscommon. Today it is open to the public and includes an extensive famine museum, as well as the faithfully restored house and gardens.
Well, what you had in Ireland at the time of the Great Irish Famine from 1845 to 1852, you had a situation whereby virtually 80% of the land of Ireland was owned by landlords. And in each area, the landlord would have a fine house like Strokestown House, and that would sit in the centre of an estate that oftentimes extended to maybe 30, 40, 50,000 acres. Now in each case, the family would maintain a private domain. In the case of the Mahons here at Strokestown Park, their private domain extended to 1,000 acres.
Part of that domain was the 4-acre walled garden, now returned to its original splendour, which contains the longest herbaceous border in the British Isles. Today, its beauty can be shared by anyone who cares to visit. But in the 19th century, it was an exclusive preserve. Typical of the Irish landed gentry of the time, the Mahons would have wandered through these gardens with little thought of the hardships being experienced on their very own doorstep. For apart from the 1,000 acres they set aside for hunting, shooting and fishing, the rest of their 10,000-acre estate was rented out to tenant farmers.
Because of the system of land distribution, combined with a very high level of population, bear in mind the census in 1841 had set the population at 8,175,000 people. That's well over twice what the population is today. So this very dense population, very high level of population, combined with an inequitable system of land distribution, it combined to leave a fierce competition for land and chronic poverty existing throughout rural Ireland. What you had was 40% of a population depending on the potato crop as their primary source of food. These people lived and subsisted on maybe 3.5 acres of land. Now on that land they had to grow a crop which was capable of providing enough bulk food to feed their families for the entire year. They also had to provide something which was going to pay the rent. Now potatoes was the chosen source of food, given that it was the one crop capable of producing enough bulk to feed the family, to the extent that some of these families were capable of growing oats or maybe fattening a farm animal. That foodstuff had such a strong cash value that essentially the family couldn't afford to eat it themselves. They were almost obliged to exchange or sell that foodstuff in order to generate some hard currency to pay the rent. They lived in poverty on the land, but they felt that to lose it would be the end of them.
The problem was made worse by Ireland's economic dependence on Britain, which had begun importing grain from the continent, leading to a fall in demand from Ireland. At the same time, a rise in the demand for meat led to a conversion from tillage to grazing. With a reduced need for farm labour, many farmers sought to clear their land of redundant workers.
There were policies in place on the estates that where a tenant fell into arrears with the rent, then they would be served very promptly with a notice to quit, which was essentially a legal document giving them a specific length of time within which they were to surrender the land that they held and vacate the house. And if the family hadn't left by the due date, then they would be forcibly evicted by the land agent, backed up with bailiff, constabulary and whatever was required. The landlord was in no position on his own to enforce his policies. What happened to a large extent throughout the country was that you had in place middlemen. Middlemen would be oftentimes local people, Irish people. They would rent large tracts of land from the landlord and would sublet it in turn to their poorer neighbours. And again, it was charged on it at maximum rate. So there was a whole structure in place.
Displaced peasants had little option but to move into unwanted bogland or coastal areas, which they cleared and manured in order to grow potatoes. In the early days of the famine in particular, a number of schemes were set up to help offset the devastation. Some of them were privately sponsored, among them the Connolly Folly, considered a great act of philanthropy by the Connolly family, whose workers were paid half a penny a day. A number of government-funded public works schemes were established. Here in County Galway, for example, a narrow strip of land separates Loch Mask from Loch Corrib, near the village of Cong. Construction began on an ambitious scheme to link the two lakes by a canal with 3 locks. The labour was provided by men employed as part of a famine relief scheme. They laboured for 6 years on piece rates, sometimes earning as little as 3 pence a day, until the project proved too uneconomic to continue. The partially completed works that still survive today echo the hopelessness of the poor, struggling to create a canal that would never carry a boat. But things were set to get even worse.
It should be pointed out that when Blight first emerged in 1845, Robert Peel was Prime Minister in England, and he was very quick to grasp and to realise the effects and the impact that a failure of this potato crop would have on a huge number of Irish people. And he undertook to import maize into Ireland. That maize was referred to as Peel's brimstone, largely because of the fact that as a cereal diet, the Irish, through their dependency on the potato, their systems were unused, and they were unused to the preparation of this cereal and to its digestion, and they found it very difficult to digest for a while, and they called it Peel's brimstone. Nonetheless, that same maize went a long way towards accounting for the fact that so few people died in 1845 as a result of the famine.
But Robert Peel's policies came under attack.
He had to alter corn laws which were in place at the time to protect and maintain the market price of corn, and in turn to protect the margins of the very powerful corn lobby. So he had to alter those laws in order to bring in this subsidised foodstuff. But that action by Peel proved to be so unpopular within his own government, within his own establishment, that it led to his losing his position in power. And he was replaced in 1846 by a man called Lord John Russell, leading a Liberal government. Now that was the lethal blow to an extent, because whereas prior to 1846 there had been a scheme of public works, by no means perfect, but albeit an effort, largely funded by the English government, with the absence of that funding, these schemes collapsed in chaos. People lived by different means. Oftentimes you had what we call landless labourers. These people who would have no resources essentially of their own, who held no land, who didn't have the money to rent land. But they may travel around from estate to estate, pledging their labour or their services to the landlord, either within the stables or on the farm or whatever, for a year, in exchange for a fertilised plot of land on which they could grow a crop and on which their family could subsist. But oftentimes in situations like this, no money changed hands. And because no money changed hands, no recognition was given to the work done by this family, other than the work that was required to tend this small plot of land on which they grew a crop of potatoes. So people who didn't understand the background could look at a robust, healthy family living on this small plot of land on which they grew a crop that would account for certainly no more than 2 or 3 weeks' work in the year. And the automatic assumption, if not understanding the background, would be these people do nothing else other than tend this small plot of land. Why don't they do something else and help themselves? So it was this lack of understanding that to an extent underpinned these policies.
If the plight of the poor was misunderstood, the Irish gentry who ruled over them were held in scarcely higher esteem by the English establishment.
They were almost viewed within that society that they craved so much as a class. This class of landed gentry would have been almost ridiculed, and were never going to actually be accepted within the inner reaches of that society.
Loathed by the peasants and laughed at by the English, landlords like the Mahons of Strokestown were isolated by the laissez-faire policy of Lord John Russell's government.
Following 1846, it became basically the responsibility fell totally on the shoulders of the landlord to supply or to provide for the destitute in his area. He would have been liable prior to that for the payment of the poor rate, which was used to fund the workhouse. And at this stage, landlords invariably found it an impossible burden. People died throughout the countryside. There are different accounts of people dying trying to eat grass, trying to survive on grass. People died outside the workhouses. To go to the workhouse system, a family had to be prepared for the fact that once that family as a unit entered the workhouse to avail of the relief that was within those walls, they would be split up. While many people went there, many people died outside of it, not prepared to accept that last battering or that last surrender of that last shred of dignity.
For those unable or unwilling to go to the workhouses, there was only one other place to turn for refuge: prison. Kilmainham, built between 1787 and 1796 as Dublin County Jail, was at the time one of Europe's most advanced prisons. As the effects of the famine spread, its population, along with that of other prisons, mushroomed. In the 12 months from 1850, there were almost 10,000 prisoners in Kilmainham alone.
A Vagrancy Act had been passed. I think that was 1848 or so. So anybody found even begging or loitering in the streets would be picked up. I think it was 2 or 3 days. Many people broke the law simply to attain food, and if that wasn't successful, people broke the law just to get into the jail here. People were so desperate that in each cell you would find 5 or 6 adult inmates. Corridors, any other spare rooms in the prison were flooding, overcrowded with individuals coming into the jail. The food ration that was doled out to the jail was meagre at the best of times, or doled out in the prison, but during the famine it was actually, I think, almost halved, just to stop the draw for people to this building.
Many who entered prisons like this never stepped outside again. The remains of many famine victims still lie under the flagstones of Kilmainham. In the wake of the potato famine came destitution. Estates went bankrupt as incomes fell, and a third of the land changed hands. In a landscape of abandoned homesteads and abandoned hopes, the outlook was indeed bleak. For many of those who managed to survive the potato famine, the ocean to the west offered their only escape. They cast their fortunes upon the tide in the hope that it would carry them to a new life, where the future was not a captive of the past. Three-quarters of the famine emigrants crossed the Irish Sea and departed for America from Liverpool. But small ships also set sail from ports all round the Irish coast. Under the shadow of St. Colman's Cathedral, Cove, an outport of the main harbour at Cork, was one such port. Cove's expansion began when Cork Harbour became an assembly point for Royal Navy ships engaged in the American War of Independence. It is perhaps ironic that just 2 centuries later, the forebears of many famous names in US history should pass through here on their way to a new life across the Atlantic.
The conditions on board ship were very cramped. The Irish travelled as steerage, the cheapest form of transport. In many cases it suggested that the Irish were used actually as ballast for the ships, for that which basically to travel in the bowels of the ship, the actual human cargo that keeps the ship upright in the water, and were confined to staying below decks. Through limited supply of fresh air, they had limited supply or access to fresh water. Again, many of them were weakened, already weakened by the time they got on board, and as a result of the unsanitary, overcrowded conditions, disease spread very quickly on board ship. These people weren't necessarily embraced with open arms once they arrived on a foreign shore. No blacks, no Irish, no dogs were common signs. And again, they were seen, they had to carve out their own niche.
Those who sailed in the squalid emigrant ships to America carried with them more than the dreams in their heads. They bore a firm resolve to see Ireland freed from its misery, a resolve that would rebound back across the Atlantic in the years ahead. Long before the Great Ice Age, a series of volcanic eruptions in Northern Ireland and Western Scotland produced a spectacular group of rock formations that extend into the sea like a sloping pavement, the Giant's Causeway. The name derives from a legend that it was built by Irish giant Finn McCool, so that a Scottish giant could walk across it to Ireland and accept his invitation for a trial of strength. Whatever its origins, the legend finds curious echoes in events that have occurred since. In the summer of 1963, another of history's giants came to Ireland. The arrival of President John F. Kennedy marked not so much the start of a visit as a homecoming. For it was here at Dunganstown, County Wexford, in this very cottage, that Kennedy's great-grandfather was born in 1820. Patrick Kennedy was but one of the many thousands of emigrants to leave Ireland for a new life in America in the wake of the potato famine. exuding little of the squalor that prompted Patrick Kennedy to leave, this little plot of land is nevertheless a reminder of why Irish Americans and homesteads both became significant factors in Irish life. American involvement began when John O'Mahony founded the Fenians in New York in 1858. Named after Gaelic warriors, they had obtained first-hand battle experience in the American Civil War and mirrored the Irish Republican Brotherhood that had been set up in Ireland itself earlier that year.
They looked at the situation as it held in the 1860s, and with all the trauma and grief that went with the famine and all that followed it, and they came to the conclusion that the only way to move forward was by armed insurrection. There was this attitude to that the British Empire should be hit, or might be hit, in places other than Ireland. And of course, something people don't always remember, there was an invasion or attempted invasion of Canada in 1866 by the Fenian movement, as it then was. And in fact, as far as I know, it's the first known example or usage of the term IRA, something that people associate very much with the 20th century, but certainly the people who crossed the Canadian border in 1866 are depicted anyway using a flag with the Irish Republican Army as they saw themselves on it.
In Ireland itself, the initial failure of the Fenians to provoke America into war with Britain only confirmed the gulf between the warriors who used words and those who chose weapons. The arrival of William Gladstone as British Prime Minister in 1868 saw the Protestant Church's minority privileges removed. Sensitive to Ireland's problems, Gladstone gave security of tenure to tenants who paid their rent, ensured vacating tenants were compensated for improvements they had made, and transferred the adjudgment of fair rents from landlords to a land court. This gave some encouragement to constitutional nationalists. A key figure amongst those who chose political rather than military action was born here on the Avondale estate in County Wicklow. Charles Stewart Parnell had an Irish father and an American mother. Parnell devoted himself to achieving Home Rule, whereby Ireland would have its own parliament to administer its internal affairs, with the Imperial Parliament in London handling international matters. He entered the British Parliament in 1875, but it was here at Avondale that he spent much of his time. Although Parnell sought to achieve his aspirations through politics, as in the past, nature had a say in the outcome of events. The 1877 harvest was poor, and this led to a flood of cheap grain imports from America. Prices plummeted, and Irish tenants could no longer afford their rents. With a new wave of evictions threatening, Parnell helped set up the National Land League of Ireland. A key to the Land League's success was the way it united all sectors of the nationalist movement. And instrumental in achieving that was a man born in Strade, County Mayo, and buried here on the outskirts of the village. Today, the adjacent friary is a museum in his honour, a tribute to someone whose work was to help change the face of Ireland, Michael Davitt. Davitt was only 4 years old when his family was evicted from its home here in Strade, unable to pay the rent because of the debt his father had accumulated during the famine. Like many other families, the Davitts were forced into the workhouse. before eventually raising the fare to go to England. England was by now an industrial society, and at the age of 9, Michael Davitt started work in the mills at Haslington. Industrial injury was common at the time, and the amputation of his hand while working there initially forced him into unemployment.
He went and he studied at night in the mechanical institutes that were being set up all over Britain at the particular time, and it was in the Mechanical Institute that he got his first interest in Irish history and Irish politics.
Around this time, he became an organiser for the Irish Republican Brotherhood in northern England and became involved in gun running, which led to a 14-year prison sentence. Released after 7 years, he returned to Ireland, somewhat a celebrity, and was greeted in Dublin by Parnell, amongst others. Shocked to find that evictions were still taking place, Davitt helped organise a mass meeting in Irishtown on the 20th of April, 1879. It is variously estimated that between 6,000 and 13,000 attended the meeting, which succeeded in getting a landlord to reduce his rent by 25%. With Parnell watching events from a distance, Davitt realised just how effective peaceful protest could be.
He more or less turned his back on violence and saw the futility of it, and realised that the lads that he had kicked football in the streets of Haslington, who were in the police force or in the whichever force they were in the army, that they were basically doing a work. They were finding work for themselves, and that it wasn't with them that he had the gripe. It was actually with Parliament and Westminster that the people of Ireland had the complaint.
Parnell was encouraged by what he saw, and when another mass meeting was held, he attended in person and agreed to become president of the Land League.
This is what Davitt needed, because Davitt was a Fenian and he had that tag, and he needed, shall we say, the respectability of the politicians. And Parnell, when he came down to Westport, he told the people at that particular mass meeting to keep a firm grip on your homesteads. And that was kind of more or less the battle cry of the land war, to keep a firm grip on your homestead.
The Land League set out 3 objectives: fair rents, fixity of tenure, and free sale of land. But success in achieving them required widespread support, which meant that the Fenians, who openly espoused violent methods, had to be brought on board.
Davitt realised that he had to kind of make some kind of agreement with the Fenians, and he had a meeting with Devoy, who was the senior member of the Fenians, and they came up with a new departure, and it was that we would all work for the land, for the people, and if it didn't succeed, Devoy was inclined to say they would then use the Fenian method, and Parnell went along with that, shall we say. But he had the feeling that if there was enough force and if it was presented to Westminster in a very strong fashion, that they would succeed in getting the reform that they needed.
One of the Land League's techniques was to ostracise anyone who took over an evicted tenant's land. The effectiveness of this tactic was established at Cong, when around 50 workers were brought in to work on land whose tenants had been evicted by a Captain Boycott. Following this, ostracism became a common tactic, and the word boycott entered the language forever. In October 1880, Michael Davitt went to New York, where he met up with Fanny Parnell, Charles Parnell's sister, and gained her help in forming the Ladies' Land League with a view to raising money. Impressed with her efforts, Davitt asked Parnell's other sister, Anna, to come to Ireland and set up a similar organisation there. The Ladies' Land League effectively kept the movement alive, for when Prime Minister Gladstone introduced his land bill to Parliament, Parnell denounced it as inadequate. Soon after that, the Land League was suppressed, and its leaders, including Parnell himself, were imprisoned.
While he was there, the Ladies' Land League ran the operation and actually ran it very well because it was beginning to disintegrate, and the Ladies' Land League in America was very well organised. They had great organisational ability, the women, and they brought this to bear on the Ladies' Land League.
But with their efforts diverted away from fundraising, they ran into debt. When Parnell came out of prison, he paid off these debts, but only on condition that the Ladies' Land League would disband. It was small thanks for their role in achieving the victory that was to come. Through the Kilmainham Treaty and various Acts of Parliament passed between 1881 and 1903, all of the Land League's key objectives were achieved. Anna Parnell never spoke to her brother again. She died unknown in England in a drowning accident. Such was the social outlook of the period that most of the Ladies' Land League documents were shredded. Michael Davitt went on to help the British Labour Party to its first ever victory and championed the oppressed throughout the world. But he will always be remembered for his role in laying the foundations of modern Ireland.
They were literally the tenant farmers, and they were now become occupiers and owners of the land, of their own land. So it changed the whole face of Ireland, and it also gave them an independence, and it set the route for moving forward.
To many, moving forward meant Home Rule. Following the 1885 general election, the Irish Party held the balance of power in the London Parliament. This ensured that Home Rule would stay high on the political agenda. It also led to a trial of strength, which, like Finn McCool's legendary exploits, involved opponents who first came to Ireland from Scotland. Ulster's 500,000 Protestants vehemently opposed Home Rule. Their opposition partly sprang from the cultural distinctiveness of these descendants of the 17th century Scots settlers and planters. But here in Belfast in particular, something else happened during the 19th century which strengthened their conviction that Ulster was different. While in the rest of Ireland the Land League was struggling with the issues facing a predominantly rural society, Belfast had already begun a transformation. Between 1800 and 1850, its population mushroomed from 20,000 to 100,000. As the large numbers of buildings that date from the 19th century indicate, whereas most of Ireland was steeped in poverty, Belfast was becoming a centre of wealth. For the city was in the grip of its latest import from England, the Industrial Revolution. One of the architects whose work reflects this is Sir Charles Lanyon, who was responsible for Belfast Castle on the Antrim Road. But the links between wealth, trade and industry are most clearly reflected in Lanyon's Customs House, erected in 1857. It is in the shadows of Belfast City Hall, completed in 1906 to celebrate the granting of city status by Queen Victoria, that we find the clues that point to the foundations of Belfast's rapid industrialisation. For as Victoria herself stares solemnly down, she is flanked by two bronze figures. One represents shipbuilding, whilst the other depicts spinning. Spinning was given a huge boost by the arrival of the Huguenots. Seeking refuge from persecution in France, they brought with them superior methods of linen production. Belfast's position at the mouth of the River Lagan made it well placed to benefit from the industrialization of spinning, which in turn promoted the development of numerous shipbuilding yards. Industrialization meant that the region around Belfast became more different than ever to the rest of Ireland.
The planning of salvation is of the Lord.
This gave Ulster Protestants, particularly Presbyterians, added reason to oppose Home Rule. Not only would it weaken their links with Britain, but they feared it would undermine Ulster's relative prosperity and cast them adrift as a minority.
God planned a way.
To widen the gulf even further, just as Ulster was sharing in the industrialization that had swept over England, the rest of Ireland was beginning to rediscover its own distinctive Gaelic roots.
For instance, the Gaelic Athletic Association had been formed in 1884. The Gaelic League, devoted to reviving and spreading the Irish language, was formed in 1893. And the Sinn Féin party was formed in, I think, 1904, 1905.
A key figure in the resurgence of Irish culture was in fact a Protestant, Douglas Hyde.
Well, Douglas Hyde, he was born in Castlerea and reared in Roscommon, in the Portahard area of Roscommon. He was the descendant of several generations of Protestant ministers, and he himself was sent to Trinity College, or went to Trinity College, with the intention, well, from his father's point of view, of becoming a minister in the Church of Ireland as well, but that's not the way it turned out.
Hyde's leaning towards Gaelic culture, rather than the Church of Ireland, stemmed from his boyhood. Illness forced him to be schooled mainly at home, and he would mix with Irish speakers who worked on his father's lands.
He excelled in Trinity College. He did degrees in literature, in theology and in law, and won many prizes during his time in Trinity College. But it was in this period that he began an association, a relationship with the literary circles within Dublin, the literary societies and the literary gatherings within Dublin. He then made gave a very famous lecture called The De-Anglicization of the Irish Nation in 1892. And this was the year before the Gaelic League was founded. And it had a major influence on this philosophy and the subsequent history of the Gaelic League itself. This was a vision of, first of all, rescuing aspects of Irish culture from the long history of indifference and oppression by the colonial tradition. It also involved restoring to the people a sense of personal pride and confidence in themselves, removing the sense of false shame they had in their language and their traditions, and also recreating a dynamic vision for the future of an independent Irish people. The philosophy of the Gaelic League provided what in fact was the intellectual context of the movement for Irish freedom in other spheres, in the political and military spheres. It provided the context and the background for that revolution.
The Curragh, an extensive plain of springy turf, has for centuries been associated with horse racing and military maneuvers. Today it remains a centre for both. 21 years after the formation of the Gaelic League, it was here that, encountering a group of illegally armed Ulster volunteers, British officers threatened to refuse orders to fire on them. What became known as the Curragh Mutiny highlights the dilemma that loyalists found themselves in as cultural and political aims became more intertwined. In 1912, once again holding the balance of power at Westminster, the Irish party led by John Redmond successfully pushed for the introduction of a Home Rule Bill. Such was the alarm raised in Ulster that 500,000 Protestants signed a covenant pledging never to recognise a Home Rule Parliament. Led by Edward Carson, an MP and lawyer from Dublin, their defiance was backed by force from 1913, when recruitment started for the Ulster Volunteer Force.
The Ulster Volunteer Force was set up, and its leaders sought about arming it, and whilst they were technically, in fact, they were loyalists and loyal to the empire, at the same time they were willing, or at least declared themselves willing, to take up arms if necessary against the British Army. So they had to define what loyalism meant, and they had to define to whom or to what were they loyal.
The nationalist response was to form the Irish Volunteers.
Not all the volunteers, of course, were Republicans. In fact, a huge amount of them were not Republicans in the generally accepted sense of the word. They were set up to defend Home Rule, as they saw it, against the activities of the Carsonites, the Ulster Volunteer Force.
Economically different, culturally different, and now militarily opposed. Could it be that Ulster's destiny was also different? Some were beginning to think so. But events intervened.
When the First World War got underway, the majority of that volunteer force, of the Irish Volunteers, on the advice of the Irish parliamentary leader, John Redmond, became involved in the First World War.
By backing the British war effort and agreeing that implementation of the Home Rule Act should be suspended for the duration of the war, so that Ulster's concerns could be addressed, Redmond hoped he might eventually win over the Unionists. It was while the war was at its height that on the spring holiday morning of Monday, April the 24th, 1916, a small band of middle-class intellectuals marched out along this Dublin street. They were led by Pádraig Pearse, a shy schoolmaster and founder member of the Irish Volunteers. It was in a small cottage here on the shores of Loch Arula in Connemara that Pearse had spent his holidays studying the Irish language. A member of the Gaelic League and doubtless influenced by the ideas of Douglas Hyde, he was passionate about teaching Irish culture. Armed with aged rifles and agricultural implements, Pearse and his 150 followers took over Dublin's General Post Office. Standing in front of it, Pearse proudly declared the establishment under a provisional government of an Irish Republic. Most Dubliners, like the British, were baffled by the sight of Pearse and his men. Indeed, many Dublin housewives made tea for the British troops sent to quell the rebellion, regarding it as treachery at a time when 1 million Irishmen were fighting in France.
Pádraig Pearse was Commander-in-Chief of the Republican Army, and he was also President of the Provisional Government. They proclaimed a republic, and they held their garrisons against the British military. Now, they were grossly outnumbered, almost 20 to 1 by the end of Easter week. There had been some very stiff fighting. The plans had been the plans laid by the Supreme Council of the Irish Republican Brotherhood that the rising should be nationwide. They were going to use the Irish Volunteers to this effect. Plans miscarried. Pearse then, 6 days after he gave the order to take the garrisons, surrendered them unconditionally to General Lowe.
The British reaction that led to the surrender was swift. The area around the GPO building was burnt out, and by the time Pearse surrendered on the Saturday, 64 rebels, 134 police and soldiers, and over 220 civilians had been killed. To this day, the GPO's pillars are still pockmarked by bullet holes. Even at this stage, the rebels were held in derision, at least by the press. But the mood was to change. On May the 3rd, the first 3 leaders, including Pearse himself, were shot at dawn. The next day, 4 more were shot. Overall, the British authorities took about 3,000 prisoners across the country, although many were released straight away. It was to Kilmainham Jail, which had been housing rebels since as far back as the 1798 rebellion, that many were taken to be shot. This tough British response was choreographed by General Maxwell, the British commander of the troops.
He treated it as a military a rebellion, an act of treason at a time of war, which of course from his point of view it was. 97 as well as the 16 who were executed were waiting to be shot. They weren't. Asquith, the Prime Minister, stopped any further executions here in Ireland after Connolly and Sean McDermott were shot on the 12th of May. This had a part to play in making public opinion swing around behind the aspirations of the Republicans.
The swing in public opinion was fueled by various stories that began to circulate, such as reports of how Joseph Plunkett got married in his cell the night before he was executed. But were the executions the only reason why opinion was changed?
The executions after 1916 is one reason generally put forward, and that certainly makes sense. But there were other reasons. One would have been the threat of conscription in 1917, because by 1917 the British Army, and indeed all the armies involved in the First World War, were desperately short of men to fight in the trenches and all of that.
Whatever the complexities of public opinion, Arthur Griffith's Sinn Féin were quick to exploit it.
1916 was misnamed as the Sinn Féin Rebellion. It wasn't the Sinn Féin Rebellion. In fact, Sinn Féin was the name that became attached to it. But Sinn Féin, as set up by Arthur Griffith in 1905, was not by any means composed of advanced Republicans. The Sinn Féin party of 1905 was a quite different party than the Sinn Féin party which emerged after 1916.
Prior to 1916, the Sinn Féin party had been primarily pushing for Home Rule. But after the Easter Rising, attitudes had changed. Griffith's Sinn Féin successfully opposed John Redmond's Irish Party at by-elections, whilst jailed supporters went on hunger strikes when their demands to be recognised as political prisoners were turned down.
In the general elections of 1918, over 70% of the delegates, if you like, returned to the House of Commons were abstentionist Sinn Féin candidates, and they formed then our Dáil here, our government, our first free government in 1919. And then, of course, the Irish Volunteers and all the other diverse groups became the Army of the Irish Republic, the IRA.
By refusing to take their seats in the British Parliament and setting up Dáil Éireann in Dublin, Sinn Féin committed themselves to the republic which had been declared in 1916 and appointed their own president. The man they chose was Eamon de Valera, the son of an American mother and Spanish father, who had fought in the 1916 Rising. At the same time, the IRA launched a campaign to make British rule in Ireland impossible. The IRA's principal figure at this time was Michael Collins, a former clerk in the British Civil Service, who, like de Valera, had faced imprisonment after the 1916 Rising. Collins built up a formidable intelligence network and, with a special squad, assassinated British intelligence officers and key Irish detectives. The War of Independence was underway. Cork is one of the many places that echoes the conflict. The third largest city in the whole of Ireland, it was founded when St. Finbar, after whom the cathedral is named, built his original church here in 650. The area north of the city centre is a warren of narrow, hilly streets. By contrast, the centre itself stands on an island on the River Lee and is sometimes referred to as the flat of the city. This is on account of its level terrain, resulting from the fact that it is built on reclaimed marshland. But the term could equally be applied to the effect the War of Independence had on Cork. Alongside the surviving period buildings, many anodyne modern structures occupy sites that were flattened during the many battles fought in and around the city. By mid-1921, the military situation had reached stalemate, and in July of that year a truce was called. It was agreed that 2 elections would be held, one in the north and one in the south. With the Unionists clear winners in Protestant-dominated Ulster and Sinn Féin sweeping the board in the south, a conference was convened between British and Irish leaders. Under the resulting treaty, Ireland formed its first cabinet and was established as a free state within the British Empire. Ulster too had a separate cabinet, with the 6 counties remaining part of the United Kingdom, subject to mainly Catholic areas of Ulster later becoming integrated into the Free State.
One school of thought would be that the treaty was the only way forward. The treaty was, I think as Michael Collins put it, a stepping stone. It was the best that could be achieved at that point in time. That was the thinking.
But other nationalists, rallying behind De Valera, opposed acceptance of the treaty.
An oath of allegiance to the crown was still required for individuals here, and that was really one of the main thing that was very difficult to swallow as far as Republicans were concerned. Another thing which complicated the matter further was that many had already taken oath of allegiance to the Republic, to our government, to the Dáil. To those individuals, the Republic actually existed, so they didn't understand at all why it would be disbanded, if you like, or become a free state.
The infant Free State was soon plunged into civil war.
Michael Collins was forced to act. Michael Collins at this stage was head of the Free State forces. He attacked the Republicans who had taken up positions around and in the forecourts. And then, because neither side was willing really to come to blows after all, the personal friendships between many of these individuals were very, very strong. Kevin O'Higgins, Rory O'Connor was his best man. Within months he'd signed his death warrant, so you can kind of see the impact the Civil War had. Nonetheless, the Civil War developed with intensity. Positions had been taken. It was very hard to come away from these positions. Michael Collins was killed August 22nd, 1922. He was killed, and indeed the leader of the Republican military, the leader of the IRA, was killed, Liam Lynch, and that actually is what finally ended the Civil War.
One group under De Valera came, should we say, back into the political fold, and the other group continued through the 1930s with the dream of an Irish Republic to be achieved by force of arms.
Expelled from Sinn Féin, De Valera founded the Fianna Fáil party and in 1932 became head of a coalition government. Influenced by his upbringing in this small cottage near Bruree, as well as by the intellectual ideas of the Gaelic League, De Valera pursued an idealistic vision of the new Ireland. Vowing to reinstate the Gaelic language and culture, he spoke of a countryside bright with cosy homesteads and villages joyous with the sounds of industry. Central to achieving his vision was a policy of economic nationalism, which included raising tariff barriers against Britain.
The emphasis on self-sufficiency was, to my mind, quite laudable, But the problem was how you, in the 1930s, how far you could push self-sufficiency given the economic dependence on, say, our agricultural industry and so on Britain. Because regardless of what the political dispensations were, the country was still economically very much tied to Britain, whether it liked it or not.
The reality of De Valera's reign was a backward economy where the biggest export was its people, mainly to England and America. Ulster by now had gained its own parliament, Stormont. When De Valera produced a new constitution in 1937, as well as renaming the Free State Eire, it also underpinned the pervasive influence of the Catholic Church and laid claim to sovereignty over Ulster. But here in Ulster itself, the Catholics' elected representatives made the fatal decision to boycott Stormont. This effectively left the Unionists with a free hand. Stormont became hailed as a Protestant parliament for a Protestant people. As Catholics became a socially deprived minority, the combined effect of De Valera's constitution and Unionist power in the north left Ulster more alienated than ever from the rest of Ireland. The separate direction being followed in the south was further confirmed when Douglas Hyde, who had been so influential in restoring a sense of Gaelic identity, was unanimously elected as first president and inaugurated in 1938. Little more than a decade later, the name Eire was replaced by the title Republic of Ireland. By the end of the 1950s, although the Republic remained an essentially rural economy, a new government under Sean Lemass reflected the growing realization of the need for foreign investment.
In the 30s, 40s and 50s, nearly everything that happened in Ireland at economic level was dependent or related to what was happening in Britain. And it's only been really our entry into the wider European scene that has changed all that, or changed a lot of that anyway. There's a different, I think, a different thinking process in the last 2 decades. Let's be honest about it, Ireland has been quite effective in making best use of the EU dispensations and all of the monies that have come to us hopefully will benefit the country and benefit its infrastructure. But the challenge will be to see if we are able to use the advantages that have come our way as a basis for, not just for cresting on a wave, but for staying up there in a more permanent fashion.
Today, the Republic is a modern, well-educated society, enjoying unprecedented affluence. The so-called Celtic Tiger economy is bringing rapid changes.
We have got a good whiff of prosperity, but it has not been very evenly distributed. And there are still numerous disadvantaged groupings out there. In certain areas, the wage levels are still quite poor. So it's not so much a Celtic Tiger. It is a Celtic Tiger for some people and for some areas of society.
As the Republic, with its new mood of self-confidence, grapples with the problems facing all modern societies, in Ireland as a whole, one historic question remains unresolved. Across Ulster, different loyalties are displayed vigorously from homes, walls, streets, and even in the countryside. On an everyday level, life goes on much the same as anywhere else. But the divisions created over the centuries are a constant backdrop. In 1968, this erupted into the foreground with the start of what has become known as the Troubles. Derry is in many ways a microcosm of the Ulster conflict.
Derry, in recent times, I think quite rightly, has been known as the cockpit of the Troubles. As recently as the mid-1950s, Derry was a real derelict, poverty-ridden town. It really had nothing going for it, and as a result of the conditions and the situation then, a whole campaign arose leading to the calls for reforms within the state, including provision of adequate housing for the citizens.
The city's Catholic area, known as the Bogside, was thrust to the centre of events in January 1969, when younger Catholics, taking their cue from Martin Luther King, organised a civil rights march. Following this, when the mainly Protestant police force, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, entered the Bogside, residents responded by declaring the estate Free Derry. Today it celebrates its freedom under the watchful eye of the British Army, who were sent to Ulster in 1969 with the aim of maintaining peace and order. The fact that they were still here at the end of the century, along with the killings suffered by all sides during the Troubles, demonstrates the deep-seated roots of the conflict. The British Army see themselves as peacekeepers in the face of sectarian violence. But to some, including the Irish Republican Army, which gained a new lease of life in the late 60s, they are an occupation force. One of many opinion-forming turning points took place in this part of Derry on January the 30th, 1972, when 13 Catholics were shot dead by British soldiers during an anti-internment rally. What became known as Bloody Sunday still arouses strong emotions over whether the soldiers were fired at first or shot unarmed marchers as they fled. Two months after Bloody Sunday, London assumed direct rule as an interim to achieving some form of power sharing between nationalists and unionists. And steps were taken to address civil rights issues.
It was never true to say that Catholics didn't have a vote in Northern Ireland. The situation was pretty curious. The fact was that only householders could have a vote. That implied that you required some financial resources. Most of the Catholic population would not have had the financial ability to own houses. Therefore, they were effectively disenfranchised, and that led to the disparity and the electoral representation. A lot of these issues have long since been dealt with, particularly in the early part of the 70s with the introduction of direct rule and the various political changes that brought into place.
The virtual elimination of the civil rights grievances that ignited the Troubles failed to end the conflict. Outbreaks of violent unrest leave new scars on buildings even today. But the real scars are those borne by the entire generation that has grown up amidst bombings carried out by nationalist and loyalist paramilitaries alike. Despite the negative impact this has had on investment and economic development, Ulster is by no means a hopeless, miserable place.
Derry sets itself up as a good example of how compromise can work and how different communities come together. The Tower Museum and the Story of Derry exhibition is a classic example of that. It probably couldn't have happened anywhere else. It is an uncompromising, factual, very direct approach to relating the problems and issues that we find ourselves in today. The City Council, again, has represented both traditions fairly and impartially, and by and large has the general respect and support of both communities. It's a particularly unusual situation, and it's a situation that doesn't often get advertised.
To an outsider, life in Ulster is surprisingly normal. Cities like Derry and Belfast are thriving cultural centres whose peoples are friendly and welcoming. Indeed, the risk of being killed, even at the height of the Ulster Troubles, was a third less than the risk of being killed on the roads in the United States. There is a strong desire to move forward, with Britain, the Irish Republic and Ulster's leaders making genuine efforts to evolve a political solution. Considerable progress has been made in recent years, but centuries of history have left a complex web of sensitivities that demand subtle perception rather than simple conclusions. But it also demands a collective will, testimony to which stands in the heart of Derry. The name of this sculpture matches its symbolism: Hands Across the Divide. Many centuries have passed since the Golden Age, when Ireland was the cradle of Europe's heritage, with the key to a continent's future in its hands. Centuries in which it has struggled to retain, and on many occasions been obliged to redefine, its identity. Ulster is perhaps the unfinished business of the tide of Irish history. But then, history is itself always unfinished. For now, it must surely be time for Robert Emmet's epitaph to be written, as the land that once stood on the very edge of the world can truly claim to have taken her place among the nations of the earth.